Hey, guys. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're trudging through a sun-baked Roman tea. In your worn-out sandals, your tunic clinging to you in all the wrong places, and you're nursing the kind of headache that only comes from drinking 5 cups of watered-down wine and making bad decisions at the bathhouse. You're not in the mood for a formal meal. You're not about to spit roast a pig or debate olive varieties with your neighbor. No, you need something immediate, greasy, possibly regrettable. Something that won't ask too many questions and won't mind if you eat it with one hand while using the other to shoo away pigeons. Enter the Thermopolium, Rome's gloriously chaotic take on a street food joint. Think ancient Taco Bell, but with more marble counters and slightly fewer food regulations. The layout is deceptively simple. Stone counters with circular holes carved into them, each containing a dahlia. Large earthenware pots filled with whatever was hot, edible, and survived the morning. No menus, no labels, no real sense of order. Just a bubbling stew of possibility, both literal and gastrointestinal. What's on offer? Fried cheese balls that squeak when you bite them. Questionable sausage links that might be pork or might be optimism. A mysterious stew that may contain lentils or may just look like it does, and floating in everything like a ghost you can taste. Garum, the Roman fermented fish sauce that was somehow both seasoning and social experiment. Cleanliness. Let's not ask. The chef is wearing the same tunic he slept in, and the spoon he's using has seen at least 2 civil wars. But the food is hot, it's salty, and it's got enough calories to get you through another afternoon of not dying in a crowd. Thermopolia was everywhere, especially in Pompeii, where nearly every block had one. Workers, students, wandering poets, and very confused tourists from Gaul all gathered at these counters, trading scenes for sustenance that was fast, filling, and questionably legal. And sure, it may give you indigestion, but when the choices are a cold onion or whatever's bubbling at the corner stall, you follow your gut and hope it forgives you later. You've left the Thermopolium with your dignity slightly bruised and a lentil stain forming on your toga. You're walking through the forum now, and your stomach makes that ominous noise again. You need a snack, not a meal. Just something to chew while pretending to listen to a public orator rant about wheat subsidies. Enter roasted chickpeas, or as they were known in the Roman streets, Caesar Arietno, which sounds fancy but really translates to rocks pretending to be food. Vendors sold them in clay bowls or little cloth pouches, shouting over each other in a glorious symphony of salesmanship. Hot chickpeas, crunchy chickpeas, chickpeas that may or may not chip your molars. They were roasted over open coals until they reached a consistency somewhere between crisp and gravel. They were salted heavily because salt was the Roman answer to everything. Preservation, seasoning, and disguising the taste of regret. And yet chickpeas were wildly popular. Soldiers munched them on the march. Senators snacked on them between bribes. Children chewed them like they were practicing for adulthood. They were cheap filling and didn't spoil easily, which made them ideal for tossing into a satchel, a lunchbox, or at someone's head during a gladiator match. There wasn't a lot of variety. No chili lime flavor, no hummus dip, just a bowl of rock-hard legumes dusted with salt and occasionally served warm, which was somehow considered a luxury. Of course, the Romans swore they were healthy. Chickpeas were said to promote virility, digestion, and deep thoughts, which sounds suspiciously like something a chickpea vendor made up. But hey, if it helped move product, why not? Every now and then you'd get a soft one. A little chewy, a little mealy, and for a brief moment you'd think this isn't bad. Then you bite the next one and remember that Roman dentistry was still about 1,000 years away from solving this problem. Still, for a handful of coins, you got a snack that traveled well, lasted forever, and gave you something to do with your mouth during long political speeches. And in Rome, that was worth every cracked tooth. Now your stomach's asking for something different. Maybe sweet, maybe soft, maybe less existentially crunchy. You spot a vendor with a tray of golden spheres glistening in the sun. You approach cautiously because in Rome, sweet things are often deceptive. He hands you one with a wink and says globuli. What are they? Picture deep fried cheese balls drenched in honey. And no, this is not a Renaissance fair invention. Globuli were a real Roman dessert snack made by mixing ricotta-style cheese with flour, forming them into balls, deep frying them in oil, and then soaking them in honey like they've committed a crime against moderation. They were sweet, savory, and structurally unstable. Bite into one too fast, and hot cheese would launch in the opposite direction. The honey would glue your fingers together, ensuring the rest of your day involved bees, dogs, or awkward hand gestures at passing senators. But make no mistake, globuli were a hit. The recipe appears in Opisius, the closest thing the Romans had to a cookbook, and they were considered a treat suitable for dinner parties, temple festivals, and impressing anyone you were trying to seduce through sugar. The texture. Think outside. Crispy. Inside? Molten cheese lava. Taste. Somewhere between dessert and what if cheesecake was aggressive? The Romans didn't believe in restraint when it came to honey, and these things were practically candied cannonballs. And while they weren't exactly street food for the masses, frying cheese in oil required some resources. They did make appearances at more upscale gatherings. Imagine a toga party ending with guests groaning happily, their tunics stained with cheese grease and bees hovering like tiny waiters. One bite could transport you to culinary heaven or send you running to the nearest public fountain for a finger rinse. There is no in between. So yes, while we moderns have donuts, churros, and fried Oreos, the Romans had globuli, and in a way they beat us to the punch. Deep frying dairy and covering it in sugar wasn't an innovation. It was a revival. You just had to survive the stickiness. You now crave something a bit more refined, less dripping, more dignified, maybe even elegant. Enter the Roman answer to gourmet dessert, dates stuffed with nuts. Known as dulcia domestica in recipes from Apicius, these little bundles were deceptively simple. Take some fresh dates, sticky, brown, squishy, and already halfway to jam. Remove the pits and cram them full of finely chopped almonds or walnuts. Then drizzle with honey, or roll them in it, or drown them entirely, depending on your social status and disregard for subtlety. At first glance, they look harmless, a rustic little sweet, kind of thing you'd hand to your grandma and feel proud of. But beware, these things were dense, densely packed, densely flavored, and if left out in the sun too long, dense enough to cause dental trauma. Imagine nature's candy turned into a polite form of edible masonry. They weren't just for nobles, though the rich definitely flaunted them at feasts. Slaves and working-class citizens occasionally got their hands on dried dates too, especially around festivals when indulgence was briefly encouraged and digestive consequences were quietly ignored. The texture was, well, enthusiastic. The date provided chewy resistance, the nut added a crunchy surprise, and the honey acted as ancient Roman superglue. Eating one often requires commitment and privacy. They stuck to your teeth, your hands, your toga, and occasionally your personal relationships if you took the last one. Nutrition-wise, surprisingly solid. Dates were high in sugar and energy. Nuts gave a protein boost, and honey. Well, honey just made everything feel fancier. Romans claimed it aided digestion, but let's be honest, they were mostly just thrilled to have something sweet that didn't come with bones in it. As a bonus, these treats traveled well, making them the perfect gift offering or last-minute apology. Soldiers carried them into battle. Lovers passed them like edible love notes. And if things got rough, they doubled as throwable objects with just enough heft to make your point. In the empire that conquered the known world, this was one of its most beloved desserts. Sticky, satisfying, and potentially dangerous. Let's take a sharp turn into the slightly unhinged, because if there's one Roman snack that still raises eyebrows today, it's this one. Stuffed dormice. Yes, small. Fuzzy rodents with big eyes and an unfortunate tendency to end up on elite Roman dinner plates. Think of it as the original tension between awe and MMM. Now, to be fair, not everyone was out here eating glorified pet hamsters. This was primarily a rich people thing. Ordinary folks stuck with lentils and boiled onions. But if you were part of the Roman upper crust, the toga-wearing, poetry-quoting, villa-owning kind, you absolutely served dormice to guests. Not out of necessity, but because, well, status. The dormice were fattened in little terracotta jars called gleraria, which is basically a mouse-sized gym with no exit. The goal was to make them nice and plump before stuffing them with minced pork, herbs, and nuts. Then they were either roasted, dipped in honey, or both. Because why just cross one culinary line when you can sprint past several? Guests would pick them up delicately, as if pretending not to notice the tail still attached. The flavor was described as nutty, but you can bet that's the kind of thing people say to sound cultured. Realistically, it probably tasted like greasy fare and bad decisions. And the thing is, they weren't even illegal. In fact, dormice farming was regulated. That's how widespread this practice was. The Romans wrote about it, joked about it, even carved them onto fancy mosaics, as if to say, here lies Gaius. He had money. He had mice. But here's the kicker. Despite the weirdness, they were considered delicacies, like the foie gras of the Roman world. Lavish, controversial, and a little morally ambiguous. So why did they eat them? Because they could. Because they wanted to impress people. Because culinary restraint wasn't really in vogue when you ran the Mediterranean. To us, it sounded horrifying. To them, it was finger food with flair. And in a culture where eating flamingo tongues wasn't even the weirdest part of the menu, a crispy honey-glazed dormouse was practically tame. Naturally, you deserve something comforting, something golden, something that doesn't look back at you. Enter the honey cake, or as the Romans knew it, lima. Now to be clear, these weren't your modern, soft, fluffy sponge cakes. No one was Instagramming slices of these. Roman honey cakes were dense, weighty, more like a sweet brick than a dessert, and they came in all shapes and levels of chewiness, ranging from pleasantly spongy to requiring a dagger. The classic Libyan recipe: cheese, flour, and egg mixed into a thick dough, shaped into a tidy little loaf and baked on a leaf. Because if you're not baking on foliage, or even Roman, once baked, they were drenched in honey, not drizzled, not glazed, drenched. The kind of soak that ruins tunics and friendships when there's only one slice left. Honey was liquid gold in Rome. It was a sweetener, a preservative, a skin ointment, and apparently the answer to what we should dump on this questionable cake. The result was a sticky, slightly sour, cheesy sweet treat that clung to your fingers and social reputation alike. They were served at religious festivals, family gatherings, and offerings to the household gods, which meant that occasionally your breakfast pastry was also a spiritual sacrifice. No pressure. And just like every other Roman dish, there were class layers baked in. Poorer families might use barley or rye, skip the cheese, and use a splash of diluted honey. A cake in technicality only. The rich, of course, added nuts, spices, and enough honey to drown a centurion. But here's the kicker. They were beloved. The kind of thing people remember from childhood, fought over at banquets and hoarded like bees in togas. They weren't fancy, they weren't pretty, but they were sweet, sticky, and capable of triggering property disputes. Imagine waking up in ancient Rome. The streets are already noisy. Your neighbor is shouting about overdue amphory, and your head is pounding from last night's 1 cup of diluted wine that turned into 4. You're groggy, broke, and late. Naturally, you reach for breakfast, but not eggs, not fruit, not even a proper meal. No, you're going with a classic Roman start to the day. Stale bread soaked in wine. Yes, it was a thing. Romans called it sapi and vinum, which sounds like a spell, but just means bread and wine. Essentially, you took old hardened bread because fresh bread was either expensive or mysteriously missing, tore it into chunks, and drowned it in whatever wine-like substance was lying around. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't pretty. It was Roman cereal, minus the milk, sugar, and joy. But it got the job done. The wine softened the rock-hard bread just enough to make it chewable. Red or white didn't matter. If it had fermented grapes in it and was vaguely liquid, it was going in. Occasionally people added herbs or honey, but that was for special occasions. Or if you were trying to impress someone who'd already seen you eat dormice. It was a breakfast of necessity and efficiency. Farmers ate it before a day in the fields. Laborers ate it before hauling bricks in the sun. Philosophers ate it while pretending not to cry in public. If coffee jump-started modern civilization, this was Rome's lukewarm wine-flavored equivalent. Of course, the elite mocked it while secretly indulging in their own versions, using aged wine, honeyed bread, and the smug expression of someone pretending to slum it for the experience. But for the average Roman, this was the real start to the day. And here's the twist. Sometimes it wasn't even breakfast. Some people just dipped bread in wine constantly. During meals, during speeches, during casual eavesdropping in the forum. It was a food, a drink, and a lifestyle choice. Was it nutritious? Barely. Was it dignified? Not especially, but it was soft, cheap, and soaked in alcohol, which in ancient Rome qualified as a win. Sausages. Humanity's age-old solution to the eternal question. What do we do with the leftover bits? And nowhere was this meat wrangling more enthusiastically embraced than in ancient Rome, where sausage making was less about recipes and more about pushing the boundaries of what could legally be considered food. The Roman version, Lucanica, a sausage named after the region of Lucania, though by the time it hit the stalls of Rome, nobody really cared about geography. What they cared about was that it was salty. Greasy, spicy, and suspiciously chewy ingredients. Well, that's where things get exciting. Lucanica was often a delightful mystery of pork trimmings, liver, lungs, heart, and possibly things best left undocumented. Seasoned with pepper, cumin, fennel seeds, and a dash of bravado, it was then stuffed into an intestine casing and grilled, fried or smoked to mask the existential horror within, and Romans loved them. Vendors grilled them openly on small braziers, releasing clouds of meaty perfume into the already chaotic city air. People would line up, toga askew, coins in hand, waiting for their hot, greasy fix. Athletes ate them for energy. Philosophers ate them and then questioned their own ethics. Children begged for them and immediately regretted it. Of course, sausage quality varied wildly. The ones at imperial feasts might be finely ground and delicately spiced. The ones on the street, let's just say the less you asked, the happier you were. There were rumors of donkey bits, maybe dogs. Certainly organs you've never seen on a butcher's chart. Storage was also optimistic. Refrigeration didn't exist, and smoking meat was more art than science, so some sausages aged like fine wine. Others aged like something you'd report to the authorities. Still, they were everywhere. Sold at Thermopolia, eaten at arenas, carried into battle. A Roman soldier marching across Gaul could count on two things, sore feet and a dried sausage in his pouch. It was calorie-dense, flavor-rich, and durable enough to double as a self-defense weapon if necessary. Let's talk about Roman pancakes, or as they might have called them. Flat disappointment with a drizzle of hope. In theory, Alita Dulcia sounds promising. It translates to another sweet and is essentially a basic pancake made from spelt flour, eggs, and milk. Sometimes honey got involved, sometimes not. And that inconsistency alone tells you exactly what kind of emotional roller coaster this food was. You'd mix the batter, pour it into a pan over a fire that may or may not be cooperating, and let the magic happen. Except Roman magic didn't involve fluffy stacks or maple syrup. These pancakes were thin, dense, and just sturdy enough to qualify as edible flooring. If you were lucky, they'd be fried in a bit of oil and served with a generous helping of honey. Maybe a sprinkle of poppy seeds if someone was feeling festive. If you weren't lucky, you got the version with no toppings, no sweetness, and the texture of a legal document. Still, they were popular. Cheap, easy to make, and surprisingly versatile. They could be sweet or savory, eaten hot or cold, served at festivals, funerals, and that awkward space between breakfast and guilt. Romans weren't looking for a breakfast revolution. They just wanted calories that didn't bite back. But make no mistake, if you're imagining a modern pancake with strawberries and whipped cream, adjust your expectations downward immediately. These were the kind of cakes that required strong teeth and low emotional standards. More fuel than food, more endurance snacks than indulgent brunch. Yet they had their place. They filled their stomachs. They paired decently with wine. They made you feel, however briefly, that you had some control over your life, which in a world of invasions, political backstabbing, and mystery meat sausages was no small comfort. And sometimes, just sometimes, the batter would crisp just right on the edges, the honey would caramelize, and you'd think, this is almost good. That fleeting joy was the Roman pancake's true legacy, setting the bar low enough to be pleasantly surprised. So were they bland? Yes. Were they adored? Somehow also yes. Because in Rome, even mediocrity had its moment, preferably served with honey. There's a certain honesty in Roman cuisine. They didn't pretend things were fancy. They didn't trim the fat. And when it came to fish, they certainly didn't waste time with tidy fillets or delicate portions. No, they went straight for the bits. Fried, salty, sometimes unrecognizable, always crunchy. Imagine this. You're wandering the docks of Ostia, or maybe just downwind from a fishmonger in the Subura. You catch a whiff of something sizzling, something fishy, something that's probably been sitting out since sunrise. You follow your nose, and there it is, a greasy tray of fried fish parts, lovingly coated in oil and what might be flour or might be iced tea. No one's sure anymore. What were you getting exactly? Well, fish heads, tails, fins, and anything small enough to toss whole into a pan. Anchovies were a favorite. Sardines, too. Occasionally, the Romans would venture into mystery seafood territory and fry whatever creature happened to flop into the net that day. The cooking method was simple. Heat up some oil, toss the fish in, and hope they crisp before they burn. Sprinkle with salt, maybe a squirt of vinegar if you were feeling aristocratic. Serve it wrapped in a fig leaf or straight into the customer's hand if hygiene was optional, which, let's be honest, usually was. These little crunchy sea creatures were everywhere. Thermopolius served them. Market stalls shouted about them. Kids bought them as snacks, and everyone knew. If it's been fried hard enough, you don't have to ask what part of the fish it was. Nutritionally decent. Omega-3s, protein, calcium from the bones you were absolutely crunching through, and a lingering scent of the Mediterranean that stayed with you for days. But here's the magic. People loved it. Romans weren't looking for elegance. They wanted salt, fat, and crunch. And these fish bits delivered loudly, greasily, in a way that told your stomach, yes, I'm full, and told your dignity, we don't talk about this. By now you've eaten bread soaked in wine, sausage stuffed with mystery, and a pancake that legally qualifies as a construction material. Maybe you're craving something wholesome, something fruity, something that says I made a good life decision today. Enter the Roman fig cake, or as some modern historians like to call it, the ancient art of making leftovers look intentional. Figs were everywhere in Rome, abundant, cheap, and so perishable that Romans had roughly 3 hours between ripe and fermented. So what did they do with the extras? They smashed them into fig cakes, little lumps of mashed fig, sometimes mixed with nuts or flour, occasionally shaped into discs, and almost always passed off as dessert. The texture was ambitious. Chewy, sticky, and vaguely alarming if stored improperly. The taste? That depended on how long the figs had been sitting in the sun. Best case scenario? Rich and naturally sweet. Worst case? A tangy flavor profile one could charitably call surprising. Sometimes they added honey, which helped. Sometimes they didn't, which they didn't. Some versions included sesame seeds, creating a snack that sticks to your molars like emotional baggage. Others were wrapped in leaves for easy portability and plausible deniability. But despite their humble beginnings, fig cakes were popular across all classes. Farmers brought them into the fields. Philosophers nibbled them while judging other philosophers. Even the rich liked them, though theirs came adorned with spices and smugness. In festivals, they were often handed out to crowds like ancient granola bars. And because they didn't spoil easily, they became the go-to offering for gods, house spirits, and that one neighbor you didn't like but had to stay polite with. Let's not pretend they were glamorous. Nobody was writing love poems to fig cakes, but they were dense, nutritious, and endlessly adaptable. The culinary equivalent of it'll do. And let's face it, in a society where most desserts either stuck to your hands or tried to escape your plate, the humble fig cake offered a rare kind of stability. It didn't sparkle, it didn't impress, but it also didn't fight back. And sometimes that's enough. At this point in your Roman culinary journey, you've eaten enough fermented, fried, and honey-drenched material to question your life choices. But don't worry, we haven't yet explored one of Rome's most cherished obsessions: cheese. Specifically, cheese snacks. the kind that could be delightful or instantly regrettable. Cheese in ancient Rome wasn't just a food, it was a philosophy. They had soft cheese, hard cheese, aged cheese, and the kind of cheese that might count as a biological weapon by modern standards. Romans loved to snack on cheese between meals, or more accurately, between other questionable decisions. Let's start with fried cheese patties, a common treat at Thermopylae and taverns. These were made by mashing soft cheese, likely a ricotta-like curd, mixing it with flour or semolina, forming little discs, and frying them in oil until golden. Sounds tasty, right? It was, but only if eaten hot. Let them cool for 5 minutes, and you were suddenly gnawing on something with the texture of an old sandal. Some were sweetened with honey, others had herbs and were aggressively savory. Occasionally someone would throw in nuts or dried fruits, which in theory sounded inventive, but often ended up tasting like someone accidentally dropped trail mix into a grilled cheese. Now, if you were particularly unlucky, you might encounter aged Roman cheese. This wasn't your delicate French brie or polite cheddar. No, this was hard, pungent, and frequently described as fragrant, which is ancient cooking speak for don't inhale too deeply. Some versions were aged until they were more salt than cheese. Others were stored in baskets, left out in the sun, and possibly used to repel unwanted guests. Cheese snacks were everywhere, served to soldiers, offered at festivals, even gifted during Saturnalia, because nothing says I appreciate you like a block of dairy that could double as a paperweight. They were filling, cheap, and impressively shelf-stable, assuming you didn't mind them fighting back. But for all their inconsistencies, the Romans adored cheese snacks. They were comforting, portable, and only occasionally threatening. In short, they were the mozzarella sticks of the ancient world, just without mozzarella or sticks. Some civilizations have ketchup, others have hot sauce. Ancient Rome, they had garum, a fermented fish sauce that somehow ended up on in or near just about every edible object in the empire. Let's be clear, garum was not subtle. It was not elegant. It was not something you lightly drizzled. It was fermented fish juice made by stuffing fish guts into clay pots, adding copious salt, and then leaving the entire mixture to sit in the sun until it stopped screaming. The result? A brown, oily, salty, tangy liquid that Romans poured over meats, vegetables, grains, and yes, snacks. Bread dipped in garum. Absolutely. Roasted nuts with garum? Why not? Fried cheese with a splash of garum? You're living dangerously, but that's Roman cuisine for you. And it wasn't just for taste. Garum had social clout. There were different grades, some for the poor, and others so exclusive they were aged longer than your average gladiator. Liquamen, alec, and other variations were sold across the empire, with labels boasting origins, purity, and probably imaginary health benefits. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of organic artisanal soy sauce, but with more intestines. Now, it should be noted that the smell of garum production was so bad it was legally restricted to outside city limits. That's right, even in Rome, where sewage flowed freely and public baths were occasionally experimental at best, garum factories were banned from the neighborhood. But once bottled and shipped, it was gold. Emperors hoarded it. Cooks swore by it. Hungry citizens slathered it on nearly anything that didn't move. It was Rome's favorite flavor bomb, and its most widely tolerated olfactory crime. Did people actually enjoy it? Apparently, yes. They praised it in poems. They included it in cookbooks. They wrote love letters to recipes that began with first, drowned everything in garum. Was it healthy? Possibly. Was it overwhelming? Always. Did it add something magical to fried tea? Snacks? If you like your magic strong, fishy, and vaguely suspicious, then yes. So when you imagine Roman junk food, don't just picture cheese balls or fig cakes. Picture cheese balls and fig cakes soaked in fermented fish sauce. Because that's what winning tasted like in Rome. You still crave a snack, something casual, something crunchy. Something you can eat with one hand while waving the other dramatically passing senators. Enter Roman St. Let's walk through any bustling Roman marketplace, the Forum, the Port at Ostia, the back alleys of Subura, and you'd hear the unmistakable sound of nuts roasting on open coals. Not in the cozy, holiday-scented way. more like the smell of burning street cart mixed with salted temptation. Your choices: almonds, walnuts, hazelnuts, and pine nuts, though the latter could cost a small fortune and possibly your dignity if you dropped them. Most were roasted, lightly salted, and sometimes flavored with herbs or honey. Simple, addictive, pocket-friendly. Vendors sold them in little paper cones made of recycled wax tablets or papyrus scraps, which occasionally still had grocery lists or bad poetry scribbled on them. Bonus entertainment and the Romans. They went nuts for nuts. Philosophers munched them while pondering mortality. Gladiators downed them for protein. Drunken party guests tossed them into mouths, and sometimes amphorae with varying degrees of accuracy. Even the emperors snacked on them, though theirs were peeled, gilded, and likely carried to them on a silver platter by someone with anxiety. Some were even candied. Almonds coated in honey were the closest thing Rome had to peanut brittle, and they were equally capable of cracking a tooth or winning your affection, depending on how fresh they were. Of course, there were downsides. Overeating nuts, especially the gram-dusted kind, could lead to indigestion, social consequences, and dramatic readings of your last will and testament. But that didn't stop anyone because St. Nuts were fast, cheap, and deeply satisfying. They were the original Roman vending machine. Insert a coin. Receive crunchy joy. No fuss, no mystery meat, no tales. Just a handful of salty delight in a city powered by wine, ambition, and low-grade chaos. You've partied like a senator. You've bathed in wine, sung badly at a Saturnalia feast, maybe kissed someone who turned out to be your cousin's cousin's slave. It's the morning after your toga's on sideways. Your mouth tastes like garum and questionable life choices. You need help. But in Rome, help doesn't come in the form of aspirin or black coffee. No, what you get is a heroic semi-medicinal snack and the vague hope that Jupiter still loves you. Enter hangover food, Roman edition. First up is to cure all wine-soaked bread. Yes, again. Because what better way to fix a wine-induced disaster than with more wine now absorbed into a stale loaf, so dry it threatens to exfoliate your gums. Or maybe you're handed a raw egg stirred into spiced wine known as Pasco Vada. Think of it as a proto-protein shake, minus refrigeration, hygiene, or joy. Slug it down and try not to gag while someone older than the Republic insists it restores your humors. Still woozy? Time for a snack platter from Etruscan hell. Olives, garlic, vinegar-soaked onions, and maybe a bite of pickled fish, because nothing clears the sinuses like salty brine and regret. One famous option: fried cabbage with cumin and oil. Supposedly miraculous, realistically greasy, pungent, and likely to start more problems than it solves. Roman doctors swore by it. Roman diners mostly swore at it. There were also sweet options: figs with honey and vinegar, or dates soaked in wine and dusted with pepper. These, to be fair, probably did help. They were sugary, hydrating, and just weird enough to distract you from your headache. And if all else failed, you could always go full gladiator. A handful of barley, a raw onion, and a punch to the chest to wake you up. No science, just confidence and shame. Of course, Romans didn't call it a hangover. They called it being troubled in the head, which frankly sounds more accurate. And while their cures were hit or miss, they believed in them. With the same fervor, they believed fried dormice were classy. So there you are, hunched over a thermopolium counter, sipping spiced vinegar and chewing cabbage while praying to Bacchus for mercy. Welcome to recovery, Roman style. Before he was the scourge of Rome, before elephants thundered over the Alps, Hannibal Barca was just a boy, one-eyed, sharp-minded, and already forged in the fire of revenge. The year is around 237 BC. Carthage, the once proud North African power, has just lost the First Punic War to Rome, and the man nursing that wound deeper than anyone else, Hamilcar Barca, the boy's father. He wasn't just a general. He was a symbol of Carthaginian resilience, fierce, brilliant, and bitterly humiliated by Rome's victory. And he wasn't done fighting. So when Hamilcar prepared to leave for Iberia, what we now call Spain, to rebuild Carthage's strength and carve out a new empire, he took his 9-year-old son with him. But this wasn't a bonding trip. This was indoctrination before they departed. Legend says Hamilcar brought Hannibal to the Temple of Baal and had him place his tiny hand on a bloody sacrificial altar. There he made his son swear a sacred oath that he would never be a friend to Rome, not tolerate, not ignore, never be a friend. Think about that. Not many kids are raised with math, swordplay, and a lifelong vendetta as their school subjects. But Hannibal wasn't raised like other kids. His classroom was a war camp, his father was his general, and his curriculum was revenge. As they marched into Iberia, Hannibal watched and learned. He saw his father win brutal battles, form shaky alliances, and conquer territory mile by mile. Every Roman ambassador that came sniffing around, Hannibal studied every negotiation that fell through, every Carthaginian soldier who bled on foreign soil. He remembered it. By the time Hamilcar died and command passed to Hannibal's brother-in-law, Hasdrubal, the boy was already hardened. When Hasdrubal was assassinated years later, Hannibal, now 26, was voted by the army to take command. Not the Senate, not the elders, the soldiers, the ones who had seen him grow up, fight, and lead. And in that moment, the oath of a child hardened into the mission of a man. Rome may have won the first round, but Hannibal Barca was about to change everything they thought they knew about warfare and about fear. Hannibal didn't wait to warm the commander's seat. The moment he took control of the Carthaginian forces in Iberia, he unleashed a campaign so brutal, so effective, that it would make Rome twitch from across the sea. He began with the tribes of Hispania, fractured, proud, and constantly at each other's throats. Instead of marching in like a conqueror, Hannibal used diplomacy, marriage alliances, and bribery to win some of them over. For the rest, he used steel. Tribes that resisted were crushed with a mix of battlefield brilliance and psychological warfare. Hannibal didn't just fight battles, he staged them. He'd allow one part of his army to feign retreat, only to flank and surround the enemy once they thought they were winning. He played minds as easily as he played swords, and the soldiers loved him for it. Hannibal shared their food, marched alongside them, and fought in the thick of combat. He wasn't some pampered general watching from a gilded chariot. He bled with them. He inspired loyalty the same way he inspired fear in huge, overwhelming doses. As Carthage's power grew in Iberia, Rome began to feel the pressure. They had signed a treaty with Hasdrubal before his death, which said Carthage wouldn't cross the Ebro River, but Hannibal wasn't interested in Roman paperwork. He had a much bigger game in mind, so he targeted the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally just south of the Ebro. Attacking it wasn't just bold, it was practically a declaration of war. Rome watched nervously, unsure if Carthage would restrain this ambitious young general. Spoiler alert, they didn't. The siege of Saguntum was brutal and efficient. Hannibal starved them, bombarded their walls, and finally overran the city. Survivors were either killed or sold into slavery. Rome had its answer. Hannibal wasn't bluffing, and he wasn't afraid. The Roman Senate was outraged, of course. They demanded Carthage hand over Hannibal for violating the treaty. Carthage's response? A collective shrug. The Senate debated, the nobles bickered, but no one had the guts, or perhaps the desire, to rein him in. Hannibal had become bigger than Carthage, and now, with Iberia under his belt and Rome fuming across the sea, he turned his eyes toward Italy. Not by ship, not through a polite declaration of war, but by doing the impossible. He would bring the war to Rome's doorstep, and he would do it with elephants. When Hannibal announced his plan to invade Italy, not by sea, not by treaty, but by land through the Alps, his officers thought he had lost his mind. The Alps weren't just mountains. They were death traps, snow-covered, treacherous, crawling with hostile tribes. No sane general would attempt it, especially not with thousands of soldiers, pack animals, and a handful of African war elephants. But Hannibal wasn't aiming for sanity. He was aiming for shock and awe. In 218 BCE, he began the most daring military maneuver in ancient history. With an army of around 50,000 men and 37 elephants, Hannibal marched in from Iberia, crossing the Pyrenees, skirmishing with Celtic tribes, and eventually reaching the Rhone River. There he used rafts and local guides to ferry his elephants across. Yes, elephants on rafts. The logistics alone were insane. Rome was caught flat-footed. They expected him to come by sea, or at worst through the expected coastal routes. But Hannibal was rewriting the rule book, and he hadn't even reached the Alps yet. When they finally began the Alpine ascent, everything that could go wrong did. Landslides buried equipment. Snow blinded the troops. Altitude sickness. Freezing winds and starvation killed thousands. Supplies ran low. Morale plummeted. Men began to desert. Elephants slipped on the icy paths and plummeted into ravines. One soldier reportedly had to chisel frozen horse hooves free from icy rock with a pickaxe. But Hannibal kept moving. He rallied his men by pointing to the distant plains of Italy, promising them rich farmland, plunder, and revenge against Rome. He used fire to shatter ice vinegar, to weaken rock and sheer will to drag his army over nature's deadliest obstacles. After 2 harrowing weeks, barely alive and with fewer than half his original force, Hannibal emerged on the other side into the Po Valley, exhausted, frostbitten, and battered. But in Italy and Rome, they were horrified. They had never imagined an enemy would knock on their door in such fashion. The Alps weren't supposed to be crossed, let alone with elephants, but Hannibal had done it. It wasn't just a march, it was a message. Rome isn't safe. Nowhere is. I'm here, and he wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon. Hannibal didn't waste time once he hit Italian soil, even with a diminished force. He immediately began recruiting discontented Gallic tribes in northern Italy, Rome's enemies, and they joined him because Hannibal didn't just promise liberation, he proved it with blood. Rome, stunned but still arrogant, scrambled to send legions to intercept him. Consul Gaius Flaminius took command, burning with the confidence of the Republic. He wanted a swift victory, a glorious one that would restore Roman pride after Hannibal's ridiculous Alpine stunt. But Hannibal had already chosen his battlefield, and it wasn't going to be glorious for anyone in a red cloak. The place was Lake Trasimene, a foggy, narrow valley with water on one side and steep hills on the other, perfect for an ambush. Hannibal stationed his infantry in front, clearly visible like bait. He then concealed his cavalry and elite troops in the hills, hidden in the early morning mist on June 21st. 217 BCE Flaminius charged in, eager, overconfident, and completely blind to what was coming. As the Romans advanced into the trap, Hannibal sprang the jaws shut. His troops exploded from the hills, slamming into the Roman flanks. Cavalry cut off retreat. The Roman line, stretched thin in a narrow pass, had nowhere to maneuver. It was chaos. Roman soldiers drowned in the lake, were trampled trying to flee, or slaughtered where they stood. Flaminius himself was cut down trying to rally his collapsing army. In just a few hours, 15,000 Romans were dead, thousands more captured in Hannibal. He didn't lose a single officer. The ambush at Lake Trasimene became the largest and most successful ambush in military history. Rome panicked, streets filled with screams and prayers. Mothers wept. The Senate, in despair, appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, to deal with the crisis. But Hannibal wasn't finished. He had invaded their land, annihilated their legions, and now he roamed Italy like a ghost, impossible to catch, devastating everything in his path. Yet even after this disaster, Rome refused to negotiate. That was fine with Hannibal. He didn't want peace. He wanted to humiliate them in the one place they thought themselves invincible, on the battlefield, at the heart of their empire, and his deadliest masterpiece was still to come. If Lake Trasimene was Hannibal's masterpiece of ambush, then Cannae was his symphony of annihilation. By 216 BCE, Rome was done playing cautious. No more waiting, no more defensive strategies. They massed the largest army they had ever fielded. Around 80,000 men under the command of consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, twice the size of Hannibal's army. They weren't planning to outwit him. They were planning to crush him with sheer force. Hannibal knew it, and he smiled. He chose the battlefield, a wide plain near the town of Cannae in southern Italy, perfect for cavalry movement and maneuvering. Then he arranged his troops in a deceptively simple formation. His weakest infantry, mostly Gauls and Spaniards, formed a shallow crescent at the center. His stronger African infantry waited on the flanks. His cavalry, his real hammer, flanked even wider on both sides. The trap was set on the morning of battle. The Romans advanced in a dense, powerful column, eager to punch straight through Hannibal's center. And they did at first. Hannibal's crescent began to bend inward under pressure, retreating but not breaking. The Roman infantry surged forward, deeper and deeper into the trap, thinking victory was near. That's when the jaws snapped shut. Hannibal's African infantry on the flanks wheeled inward, enveloping the Romans from both sides. His cavalry, having already routed the Roman horsemen, circled back and attacked from the rear. Now the Romans were surrounded. Completely. No retreat, no breathing room, just chaos and blood. In the blazing August heat, men suffocated in the crush of bodies. Swords couldn't swing, panic set in, and Hannibal's men systematically slaughtered them, cutting them down in one of the most lopsided massacres in military history. An estimated 50,000 and 70,000 Romans died in a single day. More than the entire population of many ancient cities, it was the worst defeat Rome had ever suffered, and remains one of the deadliest battles of all time. And Hannibal, he didn't march on Rome, not because he couldn't, but because he knew Rome would not fall easily. He needed reinforcements from Carthage, siege equipment, and time. But Carthage hesitated, even after handing Rome its darkest day. Hannibal stood alone, and Rome, wounded, vengeful, and now very afraid, wasn't planning on letting him go unpunished. After Cannae, Hannibal's name alone could silence a Roman crowd. Mothers used it to frighten their children. Hannibal had Portus. Hannibal is at the gates, and yet, strangely, he never entered the city. For 16 years, Hannibal roamed the Italian countryside like a phantom. Unbeaten, unpredictable, and completely without reinforcements, he won the loyalty of many southern Italian cities and brought chaos to Rome's allies. But Carthage, for all its riches, refused to send him the support he needed to finish the job. The Senate feared his growing power. His enemies at home whispered about his ambition. They were more comfortable letting him bleed Rome slowly than arming him for a final strike. So Hannibal was forced to adapt. He became a master of survival, fighting guerrilla-style skirmishes, harassing supply lines, destroying crops, and always staying just out of reach. The Romans, under Fabius Maximus, nicknamed the Delayer, refused to give battle. They shadowed him, avoiding open conflict, starving him of opportunities. But Hannibal still scored victories. He crushed Roman forces at Herdonia, ambushed them in Apulia, and even destroyed entire consular armies that dared to chase him. And he kept doing it without ever losing a major engagement. But time was turning against him. Rome, battered but relentless, adapted. They built more legions, trained new commanders, and strengthened their alliances. While Hannibal wandered with a shrinking army, Rome expanded its power like a hydra growing new heads, and the war began to shift elsewhere. Rome invaded Iberia, cutting off Carthaginian supply lines. Hannibal's own brother, Hasdrubal, tried to bring reinforcements by crossing the Alps, just like Hannibal had years before. But Rome intercepted him, crushed his army, and threw Hasdrubal's severed head into Hannibal's camp. That message was clear. You're alone now. Hannibal's dream of breaking Rome from within was fading. He had turned Italy into a graveyard of legions, but without reinforcements, without siege engines, without political backing, he couldn't deliver the final blow. Still, he refused to leave. He had promised his father as a boy that he would be no friend to Rome, and he kept that promise every year he remained on their soil. But soon Rome would come knocking. Not in Italy, but on Carthage's own shores. Hannibal would have no choice but to go home for the final fight. By 203 BC, the tide had fully turned. Rome had clawed back from disaster, conquered Hannibal's strongholds in Iberia, and taken the fight directly to North Africa. Leading the charge was Scipio Africanus, a young, brilliant general who had studied Hannibal's tactics obsessively. Rome was no longer content to wait. They wanted Carthage destroyed, and to save itself, the Carthaginian Senate had to do the unthinkable. They summoned Hannibal home. After 16 years of near-mythical campaigning in Italy, Hannibal left the land he had bled for. He returned to Carthage to defend a city that had abandoned him and to face a man trained in the art of Hannibalic warfare. The final showdown came at Zama in 202 BCE this time. The armies were nearly evenly matched. Hannibal commanded a force of veterans, levies, and 80 war elephants. Scipio, meanwhile, had disciplined Roman legions and Numidian cavalry, crucially led by Massinissa, a former Carthaginian ally who had switched sides. Hannibal opened the battle with a massive elephant charge. It was meant to shatter the Roman lines, but Scipio had planned for this. He ordered his troops to part, creating corridors that funneled the elephants safely through. The beasts either panicked or passed harmlessly between the Roman ranks. Some even turned back, trampling Hannibal's own lines. What followed was a fierce infantry clash. Hannibal's veterans fought valiantly, even pushing back Rome's front lines. But when Scipio's cavalry returned from the flanks and attacked from behind, just as Hannibal had done at Cannae, the Carthaginian formation collapsed. The roles had reversed. Hannibal, once the master of encirclement, was now its victim. Carthage was forced to surrender. The terms were brutal. They had to give up their fleet, pay a massive indemnity, and promise never to wage war without Rome's permission. Hannibal had lost. But it wasn't just a military defeat. It was the death of a vision. His lifelong mission to break Rome's grip on the Mediterranean was shattered in the North African dust. Yet even in defeat, Rome didn't kill him. They feared him too much to make him a martyr. Instead, they let him live, knowing full well they hadn't seen the last of him because Hannibal Barca wasn't done making history. Not yet. Hannibal returned to Carthage not as a defeated general, but as a survivor, while Zama had broken Carthage militarily. Hannibal still commanded immense respect. The people saw him not as the man who lost the war, but as the man who nearly won it against impossible odds. So what did Hannibal do? He reinvented himself. He became a politician. Yes, the man who had once commanded elephants through the Alps now sat in the Carthaginian Senate, rooting out corruption, reforming finances, and trying to repair the shattered state. He slashed taxes, paid off debts, and revitalized Carthage's economy, quickly gaining a reputation as a brilliant, if unpopular, reformer. But Rome wasn't watching from the sidelines. They feared Hannibal's mind more than his sword. A strong Carthage, even a peaceful one, was a threat if Hannibal was at the helm. So Rome accused him falsely of conspiring with enemy states. Cornered once again, Hannibal fled. Thus began his second life, the life of a hunted exile. He wandered from court to court, offering his military genius to foreign kings. First to Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, Rome's newest rival. Hannibal tried to rally them for another great war, but Antiochus ignored much of his advice and lost spectacularly. Rome's influence only grew. After Antiochus's defeat, Hannibal kept running. He became a ghost drifting through Asia Minor, pursued constantly by Roman envoys who demanded his surrender at every port. And yet, wherever he went, he left whispers, stories, fear. The name Hannibal still sent chills down Roman spines. Despite his defeats, he remained a symbol of defiance, a one-man rebellion against imperial arrogance. He couldn't raise new armies. He had no homeland, no power, just a brilliant mind, a long shadow, and enemies who never stopped watching him. By now he was in his 60s, gray-haired, worn thin by decades of war and exile. But even then, Hannibal remained sharper than most living generals, and Rome still wasn't satisfied. They wanted him erased not just from politics or the battlefield, but from the story. So they came for him one final time, and Hannibal, true to character, would not let them have the satisfaction. By the early 180s BCE, Hannibal had become a living legend and a liability not just to Rome, but to every kingdom that dared to shelter him. He was now hiding in Bithynia, a small kingdom in Asia Minor, ruled by King Prusias I. Hannibal, ever the strategist, helped the king win a naval battle using a trick straight out of his playbook. Catapults loaded with clay jars, filled with venomous snakes, launched onto enemy ships to sow chaos and fear. Even in his final years, his mind was still 2 moves ahead. But Rome didn't care about snake jars. They wanted Hannibal gone forever. They pressured Prussians, sent emissaries, and made threats. Eventually, word reached Hannibal that his sanctuary had been betrayed. Roman agents were closing in on the villa where he was hiding. He didn't run this time. According to legend, Hannibal had long kept a vial of poison hidden in a ring, carried with him as insurance. If Rome ever cornered him like an animal, he would go out on his own terms. Now the moment had come. He reportedly wrote a short message before taking the poison. Let us relieve the Romans from their long anxiety, since they think it is too tedious a task to wait for an old man's death. Just like that, it was over. Hannibal Barca, Rome's greatest nightmare, died not on a battlefield, but in a foreign land, hunted, exiled, and alone. And yet, even in death, Rome couldn't bury him. They destroyed his city, razed Carthage decades later in the Third Punic War, and salted its earth. But they never forgot him. Centuries later, Roman historians, men who should have hated him, wrote about his brilliance withal. He had led from the front, fought against overwhelming odds, and outwitted every Roman general sent to kill him. He crossed the Alps with elephants, devastated Italy for years, and gave the greatest military machine in history a fear it would never shake. And he did it all while staying true to one thing, his boyhood oath to never be a friend to Rome. Even in exile, even in death, Hannibal won a different kind of war. The war for legacy. And in that war, he remains undefeated. Every autumn in ancient Greece, a strange transformation would grip the land between Athens and the small town of Eleusis. Roads filled with chanting pilgrims, smoke and incense drifted through the hills, and somewhere in the darkness, under torchlight and secrecy, something sacred and forbidden took place. This was the Eleusinian Mysteries, the most famous and mysterious religious festival of the ancient world. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a spiritual initiation. And unlike the rowdy Dionysian orgies or the public pomp of Olympic festivals, this one came with rules. Ironclad rules. Break the silence. Speak of what happened inside the sacred hall, and you could be executed. The core of the festival centered around Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, and her daughter Persephone. According to myth, Persephone was kidnapped by Hades, god of the underworld. Demeter, devastated, caused the world's crops to wither in mourning. Eventually, a deal was struck. Persephone would spend part of the year underground and part above. This myth became a powerful metaphor for the agricultural cycle. Death and rebirth, decay and renewal. But the mysteries weren't just agricultural, they were cosmic. To the Greeks, this wasn't just about farming, it was about the fate of the soul. Participants, known as Maestai, underwent a multi-day journey. They fasted, they bathed in the sea, they carried sacred objects. And then, at Eleusis, they entered the Telesterion, a great hall where the innermost rites took place. What exactly they saw or experienced inside is still debated. Some think it involved a symbolic reenactment of Persephone's return. Others believe it was a visionary experience, perhaps aided by a hallucinogenic potion called Kykeon. Whatever it was, it left people changed. From emperors like Hadrian to philosophers like Plato, many of the greatest minds of antiquity went through the Eleusinian Mysteries and emerged convinced that death was not the end. This was religion, not as obedience, but as transformation, a sacred encounter with the cycles of life, loss, and renewal. And for over 1,000 years, the Eleusinian Mysteries endured longer than most empires. Until one day Christianity rose, the old gods were outlawed, and the secrets of Eleusis were buried forever. No one ever broke the vow of silence, and so the mystery lives on. While Greece cloaked its sacred rites in mystery, ancient Egypt preferred something far more spectacular, public religion on parade. And no festival embodied this more than the Opet Festival. Held annually in the grand city of Thebes, the Opet Festival was one of the most magnificent religious events in ancient Egypt. Its purpose? To rejuvenate the pharaoh's divine essence and reaffirm his sacred bond with the gods, especially Ammoniusere, the chief deity of Thebes. It began at the colossal temple of Karnak, home to the mighty god Ammonius, his wife Mut, and their son Khonsu, the Theban triad. Priests carried their sacred statues sealed within golden shrines onto ceremonial boats called barks. These weren't ordinary boats. They were massive, gilded and often carried on the shoulders of dozens of priests through the streets. Later they floated down the Nile itself, their destination. The Luxor Temple, about 2 kilometers away, is linked to Karnak by a grand Ave, lined with hundreds of sphinxes. The journey between the temples was not silent or solemn. It was vibrant, theatrical and drenched in pageantry dancers, musicians, acrobats, and chanting priests filled the streets. Commoners came out in droves not just to watch, but to participate. For many Egyptians, this was their chance to see the divine not hidden in the inner sanctums of a temple, but paraded openly, proudly, and dazzlingly through the city. And this wasn't just a ritual for show. The pharaoh himself joined the procession, often taking part in sacred reenactments in some eras. It was believed the god Ammonius merged spiritually with the pharaoh during the ceremony, recharging his divine mandate to rule. It was a renewal of power, not through conquest, but through cosmic approval. There is also a deeply human element. During the festival, the strict boundaries between priest and peasant, god and mortal loosened. People feasted, drank, and danced. It was joy wrapped in divinity, a moment when heaven touched earth, however briefly. The Opet festival lasted anywhere from 11 to 27 days, depending on the period and the pharaoh's budget. And while each celebration had its own flavor, the message remained the same. Egypt was in balance, the gods were pleased, and the divine order of Mot still reigned. For the Egyptians, that meant everything if the Eleusinian mysteries were about divine secrets, and the Poet festival about royal divinity. Then Saturnalia was something else entirely, a week-long party where Rome gleefully abandoned its rules. Held every December in honor of Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture, time, and liberation, Saturnalia was a deeply rooted festival, celebrating the end of the harvest and a nostalgic longing for the mythical Golden Age. A time when Saturn ruled and all men were free and equal. And for a few chaotic days, Romans tried to relive that dream. It began with a sacrifice at the Temple of Saturn in the Forum, followed by a public feast. Then all social norms were flipped on their heads. Masters served their slaves. Senators wore colorful tunics instead of togas. Gambling, usually banned, was openly permitted. Work stopped, schools closed, the courts shut down. Rome didn't function, at least not in the usual sense. One of the festival's most bizarre traditions was the election of a Saturnalian king, sometimes called the Lord of Misrule. This was often a low-ranking citizen, a slave, or even a child given mock authority to issue absurd commands. Sing naked in the streets, balance a plate on your head. Obeying these ridiculous orders was part of the fun. Saturnalia was also when people exchanged gifts, wax candles, small figurines, and even poetry. It was lighthearted, full of laughter, and had a warmth that feels oddly familiar. In fact, many scholars argue that Saturnalia is one of the cultural ancestors of Christmas. The timing, the gift-giving, the candles, the feasting, it all echoes through time. But Saturnalia wasn't just a holiday. It was a pressure valve. For a society so rigidly structured, with slaves at the bottom and senators at the top, it allowed for the illusion, however brief, that everyone was equal. That maybe, just maybe, there could be a return to Saturn's mythical golden age. Of course, when the festival ended, everything snapped back into place. Slaves returned to servitude. The Senate resumed its bickering. The streets quieted. But for that week of reversal, Rome became a theater of joy, chaos, and shared humanity, because even an empire needs a break from pretending it has everything under control. Long before alarm clocks and New Year countdowns, ancient Persians were already celebrating a festival of rebirth, balance, and fire, one that still survives today. Nowruz, the Persian New Year. Rooted in Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, Nowruz wasn't just about turning a calendar page. It marked the spring equinox, a moment when day and night are perfectly balanced. To Zoroastrians, this balance reflected the eternal struggle between Ahura Mazda, the force of light and order, and Engram Mainyu, darkness and chaos. Nowruz symbolized victory of light over dark, of cleanliness over corruption, and hope over despair. Preparation began weeks in advance. Homes were swept, walls washed, dead settled. This wasn't just spring cleaning. It was a spiritual purge. Everything dirty or chaotic had to go. Fires were lit in courtyards and along city walls. On the eve of the new year, people would leap over flames, shouting, "Give me your red color. Take away my sickness, the fire." Sacred in Zoroastrian belief wasn't just heat and light, it was purification. Then came a half-seen table, an altar-like arrangement of 7 symbolic items beginning with the Persian letter S. Sabzeh, sprouted greens for growth, sear garlic for protection, scent dried fruit for love, sake, vinegar for wisdom, and more. Each item represented a moral or cosmic value. Temples, called fire temples, held special ceremonies during this period. Zoroastrian priests in white robes chanted hymns from the Avesta, their holy texts, and offered fragrant woods to the ever-burning sacred flame. For believers, it was a time to reflect, to realign with truth, Asha, and to embrace the turning of the cosmic wheel. But Nowruz wasn't just solemn, it was joyous. Families gathered. Tables overflowed with food, children received gifts, and musicians filled streets with drums and flutes. For a society that prized cosmic order, this was a moment when everything reset, not just the year, but the soul. Nowruz outlived empires. It was celebrated by the Achaemenids, the Parthians, the Sassanids, and it continues today across Iran, Central Asia, and beyond. Few ancient religious festivals have endured this long, but then again, few are built so elegantly around something as universal and eternal as light returning to the world. In ancient Athens, worship didn't always mean incense and silence. Sometimes it meant masks, wine, and a god who knew how to throw a party. Dionysus, god of wine, fertility, theater, and sacred madness. And no festival captured his chaotic brilliance like the Great Dionysia. Held every spring, this festival wasn't some fringe cult celebration. It was one of the most important public events in the Athenian calendar. It honored Dionysus not through animal sacrifice or solemn chants, but through drama, tragedy, and comedy performed in his name. It began with a procession through the city. Citizens carried giant phallic symbols. Yes, really. Waved ivy-covered staff and chanted hymns as they led a statue of Dionysus to the Theater of Dionysus at the foot of the Acropolis. There were flutes, dances, and a tidal wave of wine-fueled enthusiasm. Then came the performances. Over several days, playwrights competed in a sacred contest, presenting 3 tragedies and 1 satyr play each. These weren't casual shows, they were state-sponsored events, judged by elite citizens and watched by up to 15,000 people at a time. Attendance was civic duty. Even prisoners could be released on bail to attend. The themes? Gods, fate, hubris, revenge, war, and suffering. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. These masters told stories that ripped the soul open. Imagine watching Oedipus discover he married his mother with your neighbors beside you, gasping in horror. It wasn't just entertainment, it was ritual catharsis. And after the tragedies came the comedies, raunchy, political, and often absurd. Aristophanes used them to mock politicians, question war, and skewer society itself. Nothing was off limits. But at its core, Dionysia was about more than theater. It was about stepping out of yourself, about breaking down the mask society forces us to wear, and putting on literal ones to explore truths we couldn't otherwise say aloud. It was madness with meaning. Dionysus wasn't a calm, orderly god. He was wild, untamed, a bridge between civilization and its primal roots. Dionysia gave space for that side of humanity to breathe, shout, laugh, and grieve. For the Athenians, this wasn't escape. This was religion, a mirror held up to the soul. With a wine cup in hand, and the god of ecstatic transformation watching from the wings. Among ancient religious festivals, few are as raucous, theatrical, and subversively spiritual as Purim, a Jewish holiday that's part survival story, part political satire, and all about divine irony. Purim commemorates the events told in the Book of Esther, set the Persian Empire under King Ahasuerus, likely Xerxes I. The plot sounds almost like a drama from the Great Dionysia. A Jewish girl named Esther becomes queen, hides her identity, and eventually risks her life to stop a genocidal plot by the king's advisor, Haman, to annihilate the Jews. She succeeds. Haman is hanged on his own gallows, and the Jewish people are saved. It's a story about reversal of fate, the hidden workings of providence, and the power of courage. But unlike solemn religious festivals, Purim is pure, unfiltered joy, a celebration of survival that leans into laughter and liberation. The festival begins with a public reading of the Megillah, Book of Esther, often performed like a comedic play. Every time Haman's name is mentioned, the crowd drowns it out with graggers, noisemakers, boos, and shouting. Children dress up as Esther, Mordecai, or even Haman. Costumes and chaos are encouraged. Then come the commandments of celebration, feasting with lavish meals, gifting food to friends, giving to the poor, and most famously, drinking until you can't distinguish between blessed as Mordecai and cursed as Haman. Yes, that's actually written in the Talmud, but behind the festivity lies something profound. Unlike other Jewish holidays, God is never mentioned by name in the Book of Esther. Not once. It's the only book in the Hebrew Bible with that distinction. This absence forces readers to look for hidden divine intervention, a lesson in faith without direct revelation. Purim teaches that even when miracles don't look like parted seas or fire from heaven, they can still unfold behind palace doors through courage, risk, and unlikely heroes. So people celebrate with parody, masks, satire, and storytelling. They laugh in the face of death. They mock the villain. And in doing so, they affirm something deeply spiritual. Survival is sacred and joy is resistance. In the misty hills and forested valleys of ancient Ireland, the beginning of August marked a sacred and deeply communal event, Lughnasadh, pronounced Lunasay, the Celtic festival honoring love, the god of light, craftsmanship, and war. Unlike the grand temple festivals of Rome or Egypt, Lughnasadh was celebrated outdoors, on hilltops, in fields, and by sacred wells. It wasn't about imperial spectacle. It was about the land, the harvest, and the fragile bargain between humans and nature. Lugh, the namesake of the festival, was a solar deity, a shining warrior and master of all arts. But Lughnasadh wasn't just about worshipping him directly. According to myth, Lugh held the first festival to honor his foster mother, Tyl Tiu, who died from exhaustion after clearing the plains of Ireland to make way for farmland. In her honor, people gathered to give thanks for the first grain harvest and to ensure the earth would continue to provide. So, how did they celebrate? It started with a ceremonial cutting of the first sheaf of grain, followed by offerings to the gods and spirits of the land. This wasn't just symbolic. If the harvest failed, winter would be cruel. Gratitude and ritual were a form of spiritual insurance. But Lughnasadh was also a social explosion. People traveled for miles to participate in fairs, markets, competitions, and athletic games, often referred to as the Tao-Tian Games, a kind of mystical precursor to the Olympics. Contests included running, wrestling, horse racing, and even feats of poetry and storytelling. It was also a prime time for trial marriages. Couples could commit to a union that lasted a year and a day. If it didn't work out, they could walk away literally by standing back to back and walking in opposite directions. The gods, apparently, had no issue with prenups. There were bonfires, feasting, and dancing on sacred hills. But always beneath the revelry was a humbling awareness. Nature gives and nature takes. Lughnasadh was both a celebration and a warning, a time to enjoy the first fruits, but also to begin preparing for darker days ahead. In a world ruled by seasons, this festival marked the shift from sunlight to shadow. The wheat was in hand, but winter was already watching. In the heart of the Indian subcontinent, as winter melts into spring, an explosion of color, music, and fire erupts across villages, towns, and cities. It's loud, it's wild, it's sacred. This is Holi, one of the most joyful and symbolic festivals in ancient Hindu tradition. Known today for its clouds of colored powder and water fights, Holi has deep religious and mythological roots at its core. It celebrates the victory of good over evil, the arrival of spring, and the burning away of the old to make room for renewal. The festival begins the night before the color with Holika Dahan, the ceremonial bonfire. Its origins lie in the myth of Prahlada, a devout follower of the god Vishnu and his demon father Hiranyakashipu, who demanded to be worshipped instead when Prahlada refused. His father conspired to kill him by placing him on the lap of his sister Holika, who was immune to fire. But divine justice had other plans. Holika burned and Prahlada emerged unharmed. Every year, Holika's effigy is burned in bonfires across India. The fire symbolizes the destruction of ego, hatred, and evil, and the cleansing of the soul through light and heat. And then comes the color the next morning. The streets transform into a living kaleidoscope. People throw Gulal, vibrant colored powders at each other, drench friends with colored water, and dance to drums and flutes. It's impossible to stay clean or somber, but this chaos is ritual chaos. Social boundaries collapse. Rich and poor, old and young, men and women all become equals under layers of red, green, blue, and yellow. Enemies reconcile. Strangers become companions. For one day, the world becomes unrecognizable, and beautifully so. Holi also connects to the legend of Krishna and Radha, where Krishna, self-conscious about his dark skin, playfully smeared color on Radha's fair face. Their divine romance became an eternal metaphor for playful love and divine unity. That's why Holi isn't just fire and purification, it's flirtation, joy, and affection. Underneath the celebration is a spiritual message, the cycle of seasons, the resilience of the soul, and the beauty in embracing impermanence. Because after the flames die down and the colors fade from your skin, what remains is the lesson Holi was always trying to teach. Light returns. Joy is sacred, and rebirth is always just around the corner. Amid the thunder of Roman armies and the pomp of imperial parades, there existed a ritual so secret, so exclusive, that even Rome's most powerful men were banned from attending. No senators, no priests, no emperors, only women. This was the festival of Bonadia, the good goddess. Held each December at the home of Rome's highest magistrate, the festival was both religious and mysterious. It honored a goddess associated with fertility, healing, chastity, and the earth. But her exact origins and functions remain elusive, and that's by design. Everything about Bonadia was cloaked in feminine secrecy. The rites were conducted by the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses, and attended only by elite Roman women. Men were strictly forbidden, not just from participating, but even from knowing the rituals. In fact, not even male historians knew what happened during the ceremony. What we do know comes from scandal. In 62 BCE, the festival exploded into public controversy. That year, Julius Caesar, then Pontifex Maximus, was hosting the rites in his home, as required, even though he couldn't attend. But his wife, Pompeia, was in charge of hosting the female-only celebration. Things took a turn when a reckless aristocrat named Publius Clodius Pulcher disguised himself as a woman and sneaked into the ceremony, allegedly to seduce Pompeia. He was caught. A trial followed, turning a private, sacred ritual into a public spectacle. Although Clodius was acquitted, likely through bribery, Caesar divorced Pompeia, famously declaring that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. But beyond scandal, the Bonadia festival reveals something rare. A sacred space entirely controlled by women, where their concerns, fertility, health, family, the rhythms of the body were placed at the center of religious life. It was a moment when Rome's rigid patriarchy stepped aside and the divine feminine reigned in secret. Wreaths of myrtle were banned, a symbol of Venus and possibly sexual love. Wine was disguised as milk. Music, incense, and offerings were made, perhaps even symbolic fertility rites. But no man ever saw them. No man ever would. And maybe that's the point. In a world that documented everything, the most powerful rituals were the ones no one wrote down. Because sometimes the sacred must remain unseen, protected by silence, and passed down only through whispered memory. Long before it became a medieval obsession with turning lead into gold, alchemy began in the temples and tombs of ancient Egypt. But in Egypt, it wasn't called alchemy. It was known as chemia, meaning the black art, a reference not to anything sinister, but to the rich, dark soil of the Nile Valley, known as Kemet, the Black Land. To the Egyptians, transformation wasn't just physical, it was sacred. It applied not only to matter, but to the soul. The ancient Egyptians were already masters of practical chemistry. They produced cosmetics, perfumes, glass, dyes, and metal alloys. They practiced advanced techniques in embalming, using resins, salts, and linen to preserve the body for eternity. But these weren't just medical procedures. These were rituals of transformation performed with divine intent. Every act of mummification, every pigment ground into paint, was part of a cosmic process, the preparation of the body and soul for rebirth in the afterlife. In fact, death itself was seen as a kind of alchemical operation. Just as metals could be purified in fire, the soul of the dead had to be refined through trials in the underworld. The Book of the Dead, full of spells and incantations, acted like a guide for this spiritual transmutation. Central to Egyptian thought was the figure of Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and sacred knowledge. Later, when Greek and Egyptian cultures fused during the Ptolemaic period, Thoth was identified with the Greek god Hermes, creating the mythical sage Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes. He would become the legendary author of the Hermetic texts, mystical writings that laid the foundation for alchemy as a spiritual science. These texts spoke not just of material processes, but of divine unity, of the correspondence between the macrocosm and microcosm, as above, so below. In Egyptian alchemy, the transformation of matter was symbolic of the transformation of the soul. Turning base metals into gold was just a metaphor for turning an imperfect self into a purified being. So when later alchemists in Greece and Europe searched for the philosopher's stone or eternal life, they were really carrying forward an ancient Egyptian idea. That true transformation doesn't begin in the lab. It begins in the heart. While Egypt gave alchemy its ritual soul, ancient Persia gave it a moral spine, a cosmic framework rooted in the eternal struggle between light and darkness in the heart of the Persian Empire. Long before medieval laboratories, the teachings of Zoroaster Zarathustra shaped a worldview where transformation was not only desirable, it was necessary. His dualistic vision split the universe into two opposing forces, Ahura Mazda, the god of light, truth, and order, and Engra Mainyu, the spirit of darkness and chaos. This wasn't just a myth. It was metaphysics, and it deeply influenced alchemical thinking. Zoroastrians worshiped through fire, a living symbol of truth and divine illumination. In temples, sacred flames were never allowed to die. Fire purified, revealed, and transformed, just like the alchemist's furnace. Centuries later, Persians also developed advanced metalworking techniques. They were among the first to refine copper, silver, and gold, to smelt iron, and to experiment with alloys. Their artisans weren't just craftsmen. They were seen as initiates in a process of perfecting nature. Smelting or into shining metal was viewed as an act of cosmic alignment, elevating raw, chaotic matter into something orderly and pure. Even the earliest Persian medicinal texts show traces of proto-alchemical ideas, lists of minerals, metals, plants, and their effects on the human body. They didn't just want to heal the body, they wanted to align it with the divine harmony of the universe. Later, Islamic scholars would preserve and expand on Persian alchemical ideas. But even in pre-Islamic times, we see the emergence of a powerful theme that would echo through alchemical traditions from Arabia to Europe. That matter is not static, and that within every impure substance lies the seed of perfection. It's the same idea that would later inspire alchemists to transmute lead into gold or the soul from base to divine. Persian thought then offered a moral alchemy, purification not just of elements, but of intention. Fire didn't simply melt metals. It burned away falsehood and revealed what was hidden. And in that hidden core, somewhere between smoke and spirit, Persian alchemists believed lay the divine spark that could change anything, even the self. If Egypt gave alchemy its sacred rites and Persia its moral framework, it was ancient Greece that tried to explain it all with logic, geometry, and a touch of cosmic arrogance. Here, alchemy didn't vanish, it evolved. Greek thinkers took the mystical and chemical traditions of older civilizations and tried to make them make sense. But instead of crucibles and powders, they reached for philosophy. At the heart of Greek alchemical thought was the theory of four elements: earth, water, air, and fire, first proposed by Empedocles. These weren't just physical substances, they were fundamental principles of the universe, the Lego blocks of reality. Change, according to this view, was simply the rearrangement of these elements. Fire could become air, water could become earth, and all things were in a constant dance of transformation. Later, philosophers like Plato added layers of meaning. He described matter as composed of perfect geometrical forms, tiny, invisible solids. In this version, alchemy became a quest not just for chemical reactions, but for harmony with the ideal world. Then came Aristotle, who altered everything. He proposed that all matter had four essential qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. By changing these qualities, you could change the substance itself. The lead was dry and heavy. Gold was balanced and radiant. So if you could shift lead's properties, make it more noble, it could, in theory, become gold. Sound familiar? This idea of transmutation, changing one substance into another, became the cornerstone of all later alchemy. But the Greeks didn't stop at theory. In Hellenistic Alexandria, a melting pot of Egyptian mysticism, Greek philosophy, and Babylonian astronomy, alchemy as a practice finally began to take shape. Here, scholars and mystics recorded early recipes for dyes, perfumes, and metal alloys, but always wrapped in symbolic language. And it's here that the mythic figure of Hermes Trismegistus emerged, part Egyptian Thoth, part Greek Hermes, credited with writing the Hermetic Corpus. These texts spoke of purifying not just matter, but the soul, urging practitioners to seek divine union through inner transformation. To the Greeks, alchemy wasn't about making money. It was about understanding nature, mirroring the cosmos, and perfecting the self through the hidden laws of reality. And that made it not just science, but something dangerously close to divine power. In the bustling port city of Alexandria, alchemy found its true laboratory, not just of matter, but of ideas. Founded by Alexander the Great and ruled by the Ptolemies, Alexandria was where Greek rationalism, Egyptian ritual, Babylonian astrology, and Persian metaphysics collided in a swirling intellectual stew. At its heart was the Great Library of Alexandria, a beacon of ancient knowledge where scrolls and scholars gathered from across the known world. Alchemy in this environment didn't just survive, it thrived. It was here that alchemy became both spiritual and practical, mystical and experimental. Egyptian temple rites merged with Greek natural philosophy. Babylonian star charts were studied alongside Greek medicine and Egyptian metallurgy. The result? A new kind of knowledge, half science, half sacrament. One of the earliest and most mysterious figures of Alexandrian alchemy was Mary the Jewess. She's credited with inventing some of the first alchemical apparatus, the bain-marie, a double boiler still used in kitchens today, the trabicos, the distillation device, and a system of vapor purification. Her work suggests that alchemists weren't just theorizing, they were conducting real chemical experiments. Another key figure was Zosimos of Panopolis, the 3rd-4th century CE alchemist who left behind some of the earliest known writings on alchemy in Greek. But Zosimos didn't see alchemy as just physical. He wrote of dreams, visions, and spiritual purification. For him, turning lead into gold was a metaphor for turning the corrupted human soul into something divine. He described the alchemical vessel not just as a container for substances, but as a symbol of the body, the fire, the soul's inner torment, the vapor, the divine essence rising. His writings blur the line between chemistry and mysticism, matter and metaphor. Alexandrian alchemists also leaned heavily on Hermeticism. The teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, as above, so below, they wrote. The microcosm reflects the macrocosm. Purify one and you touch the other. In Alexandria, alchemy was no longer just about materials. It was about reality itself. It asked not just what things were made of, but why they could change and whether the soul could be transformed alongside matter. Alchemy had become a mirror of the cosmos and of ourselves, and it was only just getting started. When the Great Library of Alexandria fell into ruin and Europe slipped into the early Middle Ages, it was the Islamic world that became the new guardian of alchemical knowledge. From the 8th to the 13th centuries under the Abbasid Caliphate, the Islamic Golden Age turned cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba into centers of scientific and philosophical inquiry. Greek, Persian, and Indian texts were translated into Arabic at record pace, and among them were the foundational writings of alchemy. But here's the twist. Islamic scholars didn't just preserve ancient alchemy, they transformed it. Enter Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the West as Geba. A polymath working in 8th century Kufa is often called the father of chemistry, though his legacy is steeped in mystery. Jabir's writings, which number in the hundreds, blended Greek elemental theory, Persian mysticism, and Quranic cosmology into a structured science. He introduced a systematic approach to experimentation. He believed all metals were composed of sulfur and mercury, not in the literal sense, but as principles, sulfur representing combustion and change, mercury standing for liquidity and volatility, according to Jaber. If you could balance these two forces, you could transmute one metal into another. He also introduced techniques still recognizable today: distillation, crystallization, sublimation, filtration, and calcination. His apparatuses became the blueprint for medieval laboratories. But Islamic alchemy wasn't just technical. It retained the spiritual heart of earlier traditions. Alchemy was seen as a path to divine understanding. Transforming matter was a metaphor for purifying the soul, aligning with God's order in the universe. Later alchemists like Al-Razi Rhazes and Avicenna ibn Sina debated alchemy's legitimacy. Al-Razi supported it, emphasizing its practical medical applications. Avicenna, on the other hand, criticized the idea of transmutation, but respected the discipline's philosophical and ethical aims, even in disagreement. They elevated alchemy into something more than a secretive craft. It became protochemistry, metaphysics, spiritual discipline, and moral philosophy all in one. European scholars would later rediscover these Arabic texts, translating them into Latin and reviving alchemy in the West. But the soul of that alchemy, the belief that matter and spirit mirrored each other, was preserved, clarified, and systematized by Muslim scholars and in their hands. Alchemy stopped being legend and started becoming science. When the translated works of Arabic alchemists like Jabir ibn Hayyan, Al-Razi, and Avicenna flowed into Europe during the 12th century, something remarkable happened. A revival of alchemy, this time under the shadowed stone towers of medieval monasteries and universities. Europe had been in intellectual hibernation. But with the rise of translation schools in places like Toledo and Sicily, Latin scholars gained access to a treasure trove of forgotten wisdom. Among these were the alchemical writings, riddled with strange symbols, mysterious ingredients, and promises of transformation. The Europeans were hooked. To them, alchemy offered more than gold. It offered knowledge, power, and even immortality. The elusive philosopher's stone became the Holy Grail, set to transmute base metals into gold and bestow eternal life. But it wasn't just a material object. It symbolized the perfection of both matter and spirit. Medieval alchemists took this dual nature seriously. Figures like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon were both friars and experimental scientists. They believed that God had encoded the secrets of creation into the natural world, and that alchemy was a way to read that divine script. Alchemy wasn't sorcery. It was Christian natural philosophy, a means to understand the divine order through the transformation of substances. Laboratories became monastic cloisters of fire and retorts, alembics, crucibles, and furnaces filled with substances like sulfur, mercury, antimony, and lead. Experiments were recorded in coded texts full of allegory and metaphor, a tradition that made alchemy seem arcane and impenetrable. But beneath the symbolism, serious work was being done. One of the most influential figures of this period was Pseudo-Geber, a mysterious Latin writer who adapted Arabic works into European forms. His books became standard references for later alchemists. Another key name was Arnold of Villanova, who blurred the lines between medicine and alchemy, focusing on creating elixirs that could heal and rejuvenate the body. For all its secrecy, medieval alchemy wasn't underground. It was debated in universities, sponsored by princes and practiced by priests. Yet, despite its spiritual ambitions, many still chased the gold, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically. And so, medieval Europe kept the flame of transformation burning. One part faith, one part fire, and one part philosophical dream. As Europe emerged from the medieval era into the Renaissance, alchemy didn't fade. It morphed. It became more secretive, more symbolic, and strangely more mystical. Out of this fusion of Hermetic philosophy, Christian mysticism, and Renaissance humanism emerged one of the most curious movements in alchemical history. In the early 1600s, anonymous manifestos began circulating across Europe. Forma Fraternitatis, Confessio Fraternitatis, and the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. These texts told a story of a hidden brotherhood, the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross, founded by a mythical figure named Christian Rosenkreuz, who had journeyed through the East, learning secret wisdom before returning to Europe to quietly guide spiritual seekers. But here's the twist. There's no evidence the Rosicrucians existed as an actual organization, at least not at first. They were an idea, a symbol, and their influence was profound. Rosicrucian alchemy was not about making gold. It was about enlightenment. It combined alchemical transformation with Christian esotericism. Seeing the purification of metals as a metaphor for the purification of the soul, the Philosopher's Stone became a symbol for Christ consciousness, inner rebirth, and union with the divine. Their manifestos promised a reformation of science, religion, and politics, a secret spiritual revolution that would lead humanity into a new golden age. But they offered no addresses, no names, no leaders, just symbols. The rose, secrecy, and beauty, and the cross, sacrifice, and transformation. This was alchemy as spiritual allegory, rich in metaphor, full of veiled references. The Rosicrucians believed that truth was hidden, not because it was forbidden, but because it had to be earned through personal transformation. Their ideas influenced scientists, mystics, artists, and poets. Isaac Newton owned Rosicrucian texts. Johann Valentin Andrea, thought to be the author of The Chemical Wedding, saw the story as allegory, yet it spread like wildfire through occult circles. By now, alchemy had become layered with meaning. To some, it was still about materials. To others, it was pure metaphor. To the Rosicrucians, it was a spiritual path, hidden in plain sight. And though their brotherhood may have been mythical, their influence was very real, whispering through the centuries that the true gold is within. As the 17th century unfolded, alchemy began rubbing shoulders with something unexpected: modern science. But it wasn't a clean break. The line between alchemist and chemist was blurred, and many of the figures who built the scientific method were, paradoxically, still chasing the Philosopher's Stone. One of the most famous examples, Isaac Newton. Yes, the same man who formulated the laws of motion and gravitation spent more time in his life studying alchemy than physics. In secret, Newton filled notebooks with arcane experiments, analyzing ancient symbols and attempting to uncover the divine mechanics of the universe. To him, the cosmos was a divine machine, and alchemy was a language written in fire and gold to understand it. Newton wasn't alone. Robert Boyle, often called the father of modern chemistry, was also steeped in alchemical thought. His famous 1661 book, The Skeptical Chymist, challenged the classical four-element theory and laid the groundwork for chemical analysis. But Boyle also believed in the transmutation of metals and saw alchemy as a valid field of inquiry. So what changed? The key difference was methodology. Alchemy had long been shrouded in symbolism, secrecy, and spiritual metaphor. But emerging scientists began demanding clarity, repeatability, and evidence. They started shedding the mystical language in favor of quantifiable results. The laboratory, once a place of occult wonder, became a space of measurable reaction and precision tools. Alchemical instruments, crucibles, alembics, furnaces evolved into the backbone of modern chemistry. The dream of turning lead into gold faded, replaced by the practical pursuit of understanding matter's building blocks. And yet the alchemical worldview didn't entirely disappear. The notion that matter can transform, that systems contain hidden patterns, and that humans can shape the natural world through deep understanding. These alchemical ideas quietly endured. They simply dressed in lab coats instead of robes by the 18th century. Alchemy was largely dismissed as pseudoscience, but history isn't so tidy. The truth is, modern science was built on alchemical bones, and the alchemists, with all their strange symbols and impossible dreams, did more than tinker with metals. They asked the fundamental question: can the world be changed? And that question still drives science today. By the 19th century, alchemy had seemingly vanished, dismissed by rational thinkers as a quaint relic of pre-scientific superstition. But like mercury in a flask, its essence never truly disappeared. Instead, alchemy transmuted, finding new life in psychology, literature, art, and even modern spirituality. The most surprising inheritor of alchemical thought? Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist. To Jung, alchemy wasn't about literal transmutation. It was a symbolic map of the human psyche. He studied alchemical texts obsessively, recognizing in their cryptic diagrams and metaphors a language of the unconscious. The philosopher's stone became a symbol of self-actualization. The alchemical process, calcination, dissolution, fermentation, coagulation mirrored the psychological journey toward individuation, the integration of all aspects of the self. Alchemy, Jung believed, was the original therapy, a coded spiritual practice disguised as protochemistry. Its real aim wasn't to make gold, but to heal the soul. And in this sense, alchemy never stopped evolving. In literature, it lives on in works like Faust, The Alchemist, and countless fantasy stories where hidden knowledge, transformation, and redemption take center stage in modern spirituality. Alchemy serves as a metaphor for personal growth. The idea that life's suffering, if refined, can produce wisdom and wholeness. Even in science, echoes remain. The dream of alchemy, to understand and master the transformation of matter, finds a curious reflection in nuclear physics, where elements really can be transmuted. The alchemists were wrong about how it works, but not that it was possible. And culturally, we still chase alchemical goals. The search for cure-all medicine, the pursuit of eternal youth, the fascination with the hidden, the symbolic, the transformative, the enduring power of alchemy lies not in its failed recipes, but in its imagination, its willingness to believe that the world is mutable, that what is base can become noble, and that knowledge, properly applied, can elevate both matter and soul. Alchemy didn't die. It simply changed form. It became chemistry. It became psychology. It became a story. It became a metaphor. And in some ways it became you. Because every time you struggle, grow, suffer, refine, and emerge stronger, you're performing your own little alchemy, not in gold, but in spirit. And that was always the real magic. There were no invitations, no gilded parchment, no wax seals, not even an angry raven dropping scrolls on rooftops. In the medieval village, weddings spread by one method only: gossip. It usually started with a whisper at the well. Did you hear Thomas is marrying Beatrix? A day later, it reached Baker, who told Miller, who told a midwife, who told literally everyone she passed, whether they cared or not. By nightfall, even the sheep knew someone was getting married. The priest, notably, was always the last to find out. There was no such thing as being uninvited. If you were alive and within walking distance, you went. Not because you were particularly close to the couple, but because weddings meant food and drink and maybe a fistfight if things got festive. The bride and groom didn't draw up guest lists. They had no control over who came. You could end up with 10 people or half the county. That's just how it worked. More people meant more gifts, which in peasant economics translated to possibly getting an extra chicken or sack of turnips. Valuable stuff if you're living on gruel. Of course, you had to plan for guests showing up, but you also had to plan for guests not showing up. Some might be dead, some might be drunk, some might just forget. One guy was still harvesting barley and didn't notice the entire wedding happened without him. Because let's be clear, time was flexible. Noon could mean anywhere between breakfast and sunset. There were no watches. Just the sun and people's vague ability to guess how far it had moved since they last looked up from milking a cow. The bride and groom weren't fussed about seating charts or name cards. You sat wherever your behind landed, log, stone, or haystack. And if the pig had already claimed your seat, well, too bad. The pig stays. In the medieval peasant world, formal wear was more of a suggestion than a standard. Fashion in this context wasn't about trends or elegance. It was about not being naked and maybe brushing the straw out of your hair. The bride did her best. She wore her nicest dress, which, to be fair, probably wasn't white. White fabric was impractical, expensive, and a magnet for every farm animal within a 2-mile radius. Instead, she wore brown or gray or off-gray, which had once been white before 3 harvests. And a sheep-related incident happened to it. She might weave a crown from wildflowers if it was spring, or a ribbon from something vaguely decorative, like an old curtain or someone's spare belt. She didn't expect to look like a queen. She just hoped to look like someone who hadn't been digging onions all morning. The groom, meanwhile, tried to look respectable. He might wash his tunic. He might comb his hair, assuming he still had some. If he had shoes, they went on. If not, barefoot it was. Calloused feet were considered rustic, not rude. And if he smelled vaguely like pig, well, so did everyone. Hygiene was relative. Soap existed, but not the kind you'd want near your eyes. Bathing was done seasonally, or when it rained, so most guests didn't arrive sparkling clean. They arrived recognizably human. That was enough. Accessories were rare, but meaningful. A belt with an extra pouch. Stylish. A hat with feathers. Well, a tooth still in place. Luxury. No one owned jewelry unless it was stolen or passed down from a great-grandmother who had once kissed a merchant. Children arrived smeared in mud, proudly displaying whatever insect or twig they'd found on the way. Old men wore the same old cloak they wore every day. Old women, wrapped in layers, cast judgmental glances at everyone, muttering when I got married under their breath. But no one cared if your hem was frayed or your sleeves didn't match. This wasn't a fashion show. This was a rare break from labor, a communal moment of joy. And if you arrived with both your boots and your teeth, you were practically nobility. The wedding venue was wherever there was space and fewer than 5 pigs. Ideally, it was the churchyard, not in the church that was reserved for noble weddings and high-maintenance saints. Peasants made do with what they had, which often meant exchanging vows next to a grave, under a tree, or beside a chicken coop that doubled as a bandstand. Grass was a luxury. Most of the time, the ground was either dry and cracked or soggy and full of surprise holes if it had rained recently, and it usually had. The entire ceremony took place on a patch of churned-up mud, generously seasoned with manure. Guests arrived wearing their wedding boots, which were just their regular boots, but with a resigned expression. There were no chairs, no bunting, no altar made from reclaimed oak. People stood or squatted or leaned against fences that creaked ominously. Sometimes someone brought a bench, and the elders claimed it immediately like royalty without a throne. Everyone else just tried not to fall into a ditch. The decorations? Nature, mostly weeds. If someone hung a few flowers or ribbons around a fence post, it was considered Martha Stewart-level ambition. The rest of the setting was filled in by animals, dogs sniffing everything, chickens absolutely underfoot, and the occasional confused goat photobombing the betrothal. And then there were the smells, pigs in the next field, sheep nearby. The faint but persistent scent of cabbage stew, simmering in someone's pot combined with sweat and ale breath. It was less a wedding ambience and more a medieval cologne sampler. But still, people showed up because the setting didn't matter. This was a rare break from the grind of survival. The wedding could be held in a puddle surrounded by compost, and it would still be better than weeding barley all day by the time the bride and groom stood before the priest. Most of the guests were already itchy, sunburned, or 3 cups of ale into the celebration, which was fine because the ceremony itself wasn't exactly a Shakespearean affair. It was short, it was awkward, and if the priest had somewhere to be afterward, it was even shorter. For medieval peasants, marriage wasn't about flowers, rings, or tearful vows. It was mostly about contractual clarity. The church, by the 12th century, had begun to insist on a priest's involvement. But truth be told, many couples consider themselves married the moment they declared their consent in front of witnesses. I take you as mine, and you take me as yours. That was the gist. Romantic in a highly practical, tax-liable way. Some ceremonies included a blessing and a few Latin mutterings. Most didn't involve kissing, not because of modesty, but because no one was eager to put their mouth on someone else's mouth after 6 days without soap. The priest might cross himself, say a prayer, and then rush off to his next task, like helping dig a grave or yelling at a goose. The church had range. There were no rings unless someone found a bent copper trinket or inherited a questionable family heirloom. Some couples exchanged small tokens, cloth, a knife, or a coin to seal the deal. Others just shook hands and hoped no one backed out before sundown. Consent was the key. Both parties had to agree out loud and in front of others. If the bride said nothing and looked like she might bolt, the priest technically had to delay things. But often a stern glance from a parent or a reminder of dowries already exchanged moved things along fast. And that was it. No organ music, no flower petals, no long speeches. Just 2 peasants standing in a muddy yard, saying yes to a future of shared labor, screaming children, and if they were lucky, 1 good blanket. But despite the simplicity, the weight was real. In that moment, surrounded by friends, livestock, and curiosity-driven toddlers, they were bound not by lace or incense, but by words. And in the medieval world, words had power, especially when followed by ale now. When peasants said feast, what they meant was we have more than one kind of food today, and nobody has to steal it. The post-wedding meal wasn't catered. There was no menu. There were no servers. There was, however, a communal pot that had been boiling for hours and contained roughly half the village's hopes and all of its root vegetables. The centerpiece of the meal was usually a stew bubbling in a cauldron the size of a small cart. Into it went cabbage, leeks, onions, barley, turnips, maybe some dried peas, and if you were really lucky, a bit of meat, a chicken, if someone had been feeling generous or reckless. Otherwise, flavor was left in the hands of salt or fate. Guests didn't sit at tables. They found a rock, a bench, or a sturdy dog. Bowls were passed around, and if you didn't bring one, you had to eat from your hands or borrow your neighbor's. Spoons were wooden, shared, or theoretical. Fingers did most of the work. Drinks were better. Ale was plentiful, home-brewed, and stronger than expected. It went down fast, burned slightly, and made even burnt stew taste like joy. Water was technically an option, but most people avoided it since it often doubled as a bacteria cocktail ale. Safer and more festive. Bread, when available, was dense enough to stun a pig. It was either fresh and sour or old and sharp enough to qualify as a weapon. Cheese made appearances too, but only if the cow had been kind that week. There were no desserts unless someone brought berries or dried fruit, and no one trusted the berries. Still, it was abundant by peasant standards. A second bowl. A third. That was luxury. Children raced around with crusts in hand. Elders gnawed contentedly, gums be damned. Dogs wandered underfoot, receiving more food than usual and less appreciation than they deserved. And despite the lack of silver platters or fancy cuts, the feast meant something. It was a chance to be full, to rest, to celebrate something other than surviving winter. Because when you live a life ruled by seasons, plows, and random plague outbreaks, any excuse to eat together and laugh loudly is a victory, even if it tastes mostly like boiled cabbage. Forget blenders and monogram towels. In a medieval peasant wedding, the gift registry was simple. Bring whatever you can carry, preferably alive or edible. Wedding gifts weren't about sentiment, they were about survival. Guests brought what they had. A couple of eggs, a chunk of hard cheese, a chicken tied by its feet, or in truly generous cases, a small sack of grain. These weren't presents so much as practical investments in the couple's new life together, because nothing says congratulations on your lifelong binding contract like half a dozen turnips. Occasionally, someone would arrive with something a bit more interpretive. An old home missing a handle, a wooden spoon with bite marks, a goat with a limp and questionable eyesight. But even that was better than arriving empty-handed. Showing up without a gift marked you as either very poor or very bold. And either way, people noticed. Money was rare. Most peasants didn't see coins often, and when they did, they tended to hoard them like dragons hoard gold. So the idea of giving money as a wedding gift was laughable. Goods, not coins, made the world go round. If someone gave the bride a jug of ale or a loaf of fresh bread, they were practically royalty. Sometimes gifts were recycled. And yes, that's as medieval as it gets. A goose given at your wedding might reappear at your cousin's wedding a year later, slightly older and angrier. There were whispers of one clay jug making the rounds for over a decade. No one remembered where it came from. No one dared keep it. But the gifts weren't just for the couple. They also played a role in community optics. Giving something useful proved you were invested in household success. It signaled goodwill, participation, and maybe a hope that when it was your turn to marry, someone would return the favor with a particularly plump chicken. And despite the randomness and regifting, there was warmth in it. These weren't luxurious things, but they were what people could spare in a world where most had little giving anything at all. It was an act of generosity, even if it squawked the whole way there. Every medieval village had its own cast of characters, and they all showed up at weddings, uninvited and impossible to miss. Think of it as a social reunion mixed with reality TV. minus the cameras and with more goats. First, there was the village loudmouth, usually an older woman who knew everyone's business and had no filter. She'd start with blessing the happy couple, and finish with, "Oh, we all remember what happened last harvest behind the bakehouse." She wasn't trying to stir the pot. She was the pot. Then came the local wise woman, part healer, part witch, full-time source of rumors. She would bless the couple with a mysterious herb no one could identify and mutter something like, "May your cows always give milk unless they don't." People nodded solemnly. No one wanted to make eye contact. You'd also spot the retired soldier who hadn't fought a battle in 30 years, but still wore part of his dented helmet and told the same story about a skirmish near France that probably didn't happen. He'd shout to the bride and groom and immediately fall over. And of course, the drunk uncle. Every village had one red-nosed, overly affectionate and prone to yelling love is war while trying to dance with someone's grandmother. He'd give a bent spoon or a suspiciously light jug of ale. Still, it was tradition. But beyond the personalities, the real engine of the wedding was gossip. Weddings were ideal breeding grounds for juicy whispers. Who showed up late? Who looked too cozy with the shepherd? Who brought a gift that looked suspiciously like the one they got last year? Nothing escaped notice. If the bride's dress had a stain, someone had an entire theory. If the groom looked pale, someone declared he'd been hexed. The talk started during the ceremony and would ripple out for weeks, woven into bread lines, passed between milk buckets and baked into the village's collective memory. And honestly, people lived for it. Life was hard. Gossip was free. If you've ever been to a wedding where no one hired a babysitter, now imagine that. But with more mud, fewer teeth, and absolutely zero supervision. That's a medieval peasant wedding. Children were everywhere. Not politely sitting, not carefully nibbling bread. No. They were tearing through the gathering like feral squirrels on a sugar high, fueled by stolen crusts and pure chaos. And no one stopped them. Not because adults didn't care, but because they were busy eating, drinking, avoiding eye contact with their in-laws. In the absence of structured play or toys, kids got creative. They raced sticks down puddles, threw mud balls at chickens, dared each other to touch the priest's donkey. They used turnips as projectiles and haystacks as crash mats. At least one child always ended up in the stew pot. Not in it, thankfully, but close enough to raise questions. Toddlers toddled directly into the ceremony. Babies were strapped to hips or simply plopped onto the ground like satchels. A child would cry every 5 minutes, either because they tripped, were bitten by another child, or had their only snack stolen by a passing dog. No one panicked. This was normal. The bride and groom often ignored the madness. Occasionally, the bride would grab a toddler by the collar meadow and hand them off to someone with her years now. The child, unfazed, would simply scurry off like a tiny medieval gremlin. Sometimes there was a group of older kids, self-declared supervisors, who lorded over the little ones with all the compassion of tiny landlords. "No, you can't sit there." "Yes, we're allowed to take your bread." Lord of the Flies meets dirt and bad hygiene. In truth, weddings were some of the only times children were allowed, even encouraged, to be completely wild. It was understood. Let them burn off steam while the adults did the same if they didn't come back covered in scratches, bruises, and someone else's breadcrumbs. Were they even at a wedding? By the end of the day, most children were passed out in hay piles, sticky and exhausted. A few had acquired minor injuries, but no one was surprised either. In the grand tradition of medieval peasant weddings, music was less organized performance and more whatever sound someone could coax out of an object. If you were lucky, a local with a fiddle showed up. If you were very lucky, he knew more than one tune. The most common musician was that one guy. Every village had one who claimed he could play something. A flute, a pipe, badly tuned lute with 3 strings and 1 dream. Sometimes the instrument was improvised. A pot lid and a stick, 2 jugs, or just enthusiastic whistling through missing teeth. If no one brought an instrument, well, congratulations. You now had a choir of ale-soaked uncles belting the one wedding song they all kind of remembered. The lyrics were vague, slightly inappropriate, and repeated until someone passed out or forgot the words, whichever came first. Drums, when present, were anything that made noise when hit. Buckets, barrels, one time a well-fed goose in a sack. Rhythmic stomping was also a favorite, particularly useful since it doubled as dancing and scared away rats. The repertoire is narrow. Most songs fell into one of three categories. Love songs, where someone definitely dies at the end. Drinking songs, where everyone dies at the end. Historical ballads, where everyone dies and loses their sheep. No one really cared about skill. Volume mattered more than melody. If you were loud and enthusiastic, you were a musician. If you had rhythm, you were a professional. If you could clap in time and not fall over, you were a legend. Children often joined in, adding high-pitched screeches to the mix. Dogs barked along. Occasionally a rooster would try to solo. It was chaos, and yet somehow it worked. The soundscape was clumsy, off-key, occasionally alarming, but it filled the air with joy, or at least with noise. And that was enough for peasants who rarely heard music beyond a church bell or the sound of rain on a leaking roof. This was magic. Brief, messy magic. Once the music started, and by music we mean rhythmic banging and someone whistling off-key, it was only a matter of time before the dancing began. And by dancing, we don't mean elegant waltzes or courtly steps. We mean stomping, flailing, and vaguely coordinated hopping, performed with the unhinged energy of people who had spent the last 6 months bent over in a barley field. There were no formal dances in peasant villages, no rehearsed routines. What you had was instinctual celebration, deeply chaotic, but undeniably sincere. People formed circles, lines, or something between the two, and just moved. There might be clapping, slapping, shouting, and stomping, often at the same time, and rarely in rhythm. Feet pounded the earth with enough force to startle birds and churn up mud. Arms were thrown around shoulders. Backs were slapped, sometimes accidentally. The elderly clapped along from the sidelines, cheering on anyone who managed to stay upright longer than 3 songs. Some villagers attempted fancier steps, usually the ones who had visited larger towns or heard tales from a traveling dancer who once passed through 5 years ago. These brave souls would try a spin or a leap, only to land awkwardly and pretend they meant to sit down anyway. Shoes were optional. By the second dance, most people had either kicked them off, lost them, or discovered they were slowing them down. Bare feet slapping muddy earth became the percussion section. Occasionally, someone would fall. Everyone would cheer. Falling was part of the ritual. The bride and groom were expected to participate, of course. The crowd would chant, shout encouragement, and sometimes physically shove them into the middle of the circle. They danced while blushing, laughing, or silently begging for someone else to steal the spotlight. Children joined in too, inventing their own moves, which mostly involved spinning until they fell over. One particularly bold child often started a conga line. No one knew where they learned it. They just did. And while no one would call it graceful, the dancing was honest. It was joyful. It was peasants saying we're alive, we're fed, we're together. Let's move. If music was optional and dancing was improvised, it was absolutely mandatory. No medieval peasant wedding was complete without it, and not just a pint or two. We're talking jugs, barrels, buckets, anything else that could hold a fermented liquid without leaking too fast. Water was considered suspicious, mostly because it tended to contain unpleasant things like frogs, filth, or dysentery. Ale, on the other hand, had been boiled during brewing, which made it safer and far more entertaining. It wasn't always strong, but it could be, depending on who brewed it and how little they valued subtlety. Most weddings featured a mix of weak ale suitable for children and the elderly, and something stronger which could drop a grown man in 3 cups flat. The latter was often stored in large wooden casks and ladled out like soup. You didn't ask what was in it, you just drank it and hoped you remembered the rest of the evening. Mugs were passed around freely. If you had your own, great. If not, you shared. No one worried about germs, mostly because the concept of germs hadn't been invented yet, and also because ale felt clean. That tingly burning sensation, that was the sanitizing effect, they said, or possibly blindness. With each round, the crowd got louder, looser, and a bit more chaotic. Polite laughter gave way to belly laughs. Stories became more exaggerated. People started complimenting the bride's smile or the groom's oddly shaped knees. Someone always started a drinking song, which turned into a shouting contest, which then turned into a nap under the table. There was always one person who shouldn't have had that last cup, the kind who began by singing and ended by vomiting behind a haystack. And yet no one judged. That was just part of the ritual in a world of hard labor. Harsh winters and looming mortality, ale was more than just a beverage. It was social glue. It made people talk, laugh, confess, and occasionally fall into a trough. And at a wedding, it served one essential purpose: to turn a sacred union into a party no one would remember clearly, but everyone would remember fondly. No medieval peasant wedding was complete without a touch of chaos. Not necessarily planned chaos, but the kind that simmers under the surface until someone's elbow nudges the wrong jug or someone else flirts with the wrong cousin. Let's start with the flirtations. Weddings were matchmaking gold mines. You had music, drink, food, technically, and a field full of eligible peasants who had spent the past several months covered in mud and despair. A wedding offered the rare chance to see someone without soot on their face. It was basically medieval speed dating. Glances were exchanged. Flowers were awkwardly offered. A few brave souls attempted poetry, which usually involved rhyming hay with May and quickly losing their nerve. The dance floor was prime flirting territory, though most moves involved tripping into someone and pretending it was romantic. Of course, not all flirtations were welcome, and that's where the fights began. The most common triggers. Someone danced too closely with someone else's intended. Someone spilled ale on a borrowed tunic. Someone insulted someone's goat again. The fights were rarely serious, mostly shoving, slurred, shouting, and the occasional wrestling match in the mud that no one actually tried to break up. By the time it ended, both parties were usually too tired or too drunk to remember what they were arguing about. They'd shake hands, share a mug, and move on. Then there were the accidents. Weddings plus livestock plus ale equals unpredictable results. Chickens were frequently stepped on. Children fell into barrels. Someone always tripped into the stew pot. Once a goat got tangled in the bride's veil and dragged her 10 feet before anyone noticed. She was fine. The goat was applauded, but no one was surprised. Accidents were part of the fun. They gave the villagers stories to tell for years to come. Remember Tamasha's wedding when old Magda sat on the beehive? Instant legend. And while nobles had pristine banquets and rehearsed toasts, peasants had spilled ale, accidental kisses, and mild head injuries. And somehow that felt more genuine at some point in every medieval peasant wedding, right after the fourth drinking song, but before the goat stole the bread. Someone would look around and ask the question, "Hey, where'd the bride and groom go?" Cue the knowing smirks, the raised eyebrows, the older aunties nudging each other and muttering things like, well, they didn't waste time because everyone knew exactly where the newlyweds were, or at least what they were doing. Consummation wasn't just tradition, it was legally important in medieval Christian Europe. A marriage wasn't considered fully valid until it was, let's say, made official in the eyes of the Lord in a sagging straw mattress. Technically, some weddings even had witnesses, a disturbing mix of custom and nosiness, though by the later Middle Ages most villages wisely abandoned that part. The newlyweds usually slipped away to a barn or a back room, or a hayloft someone had swept for the occasion. Privacy was relative. There were no locks and curtains were a luxury, but the important thing was symbolic disappearance. The community understood. Let them vanish, let them bond. Meanwhile, back at the feast, the party carried on. The absence of the couple didn't stop the dancing or the ale or the off-key singing. If anything, it gave people something to gossip about. How long do you think they'll be gone? Bet he trips over his own boots. She looked like she knew what she was doing. Well, his mother said he's clumsy. When the couple eventually reappeared, flushed, rumpled, vaguely victorious, no one said anything out loud, but everyone looked. The groom got handshakes. The bride got proud nods and unsolicited advice from women who'd been married since the great turnip shortage of 1314. Some couples didn't return at all. They fell asleep in the hay or decided that right now was a good time to start that domestic bliss early. No one blamed them. After months of labor and years of waiting, they'd earned their brief escape from noise, mud, and neighbors who couldn't stop commenting. And while there were no honeymoons, that stolen hour of privacy was the closest thing they'd ever get. The morning after a medieval peasant wedding was less romantic sunrise and more hangover with livestock. Gone were the music, laughter, and frantic goat chasing in their place, aching feet, empty jugs, and a slow communal realization that someone had definitely slept in a cabbage patch. Guests emerged from wherever they'd collapsed. Haystacks, under carts, inside sheds, or simply curled up next to the communal fire like large, snoring cats. Hair was matted. The tunics were muddy. One man was wearing someone else's cloak and didn't seem particularly eager to give it back. The feast table, if you could call it that, was now a war zone. Half-eaten loaves, spilled ale, an overturned stewpan, and the unmistakable presence of a chicken that had clearly been there all night. Someone found a single shoe in a tree. Someone else had acquired a dog. Children were already up, of course, wide awake and sticky, dragging sticks and singing fragments of the wedding song with lyrics they'd invented. One toddler walked past, proudly holding a goose egg, and no one knew where he got it. Or if the goose was okay, the bride and groom are likely still hiding. They'd resurface eventually, tousled, exhausted, and probably with straw in their hair, ready to begin a new life of shared chores, livestock maintenance, and mild existential dread. But this morning, they were allowed to remain mythical figures. Those with stronger stomachs helped clean. Bread crusts were salvaged, mugs stacked, barrels rolled. Others simply sat on logs, holding their heads and muttering prayers for silence, strong tea, or time travel. The priest walked by with a suspiciously smug look. He hadn't partied. He remembered everything, and worse, he was ready to talk about it. Yet despite the mess, no one complained. There was a quiet satisfaction in the aftermath. The wedding had happened. The couple was married. The village had come together, danced, eaten, bled a little, and survived. That was enough. When you picture a medieval wedding, it's tempting to imagine elegance. Flower garlands, flowing gowns, sweet music wafting through the trees. And that might have happened somewhere. But for peasants, the real legacy of a wedding was much simpler. It was mud, laughter, bruised knees, boiled cabbage, and community. These weddings weren't about prestige. They weren't spectacles meant to impress. There were no photographers, no planners, no mood boards. What there was and what mattered was presence. The whole village came out, not just to witness the vows, but to participate in something rare. Because medieval life for peasants wasn't just hard. It was relentless. Hunger, disease, taxes, bad weather, and the occasional armed noble crashing through your barley field. Joy was brief. Fun was suspect. But weddings were the exception. A communal pause in the chaos. A moment where dirt-stained hands held bread instead of tools and voices sang instead of swearing at rocks. Even if the stew was bland, the ale ran out, or someone got kicked by a donkey, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the village gathered to say these two people now faced the world together. Let's all shout and spill things in their honor. And so the legacy of the peasant wedding wasn't captured in stained glass or chronicled in illuminated manuscripts. It lived on in stories told over bread fires and the song hummed during the next harvest. In the smile between a couple sharing stew months later, now with calloused hands and shared debt, it was in the mud's tea. Joy, the goose-related injuries, the whispered gossip that somehow became legend. It was real, it was messy, and it belonged to the people. And if the world ended tomorrow, as it occasionally tried to do in the Middle Ages, the villagers would at least have this memory, a day when life felt lighter. When no one worked, and when two people said yes to each other while chickens clucked disapprovingly nearby. Before the wine was poured or the lyre was plucked, there were rules. Lots of them. Despite the chaos and laughter later in the night, the Greek symposium was not some mindless frat party. It was ritualized, exclusive, and strangely sacred. You didn't just show up and start drinking. No, that would have been barbaric. First, you had to be invited. The host, known as the symposiarch, carefully curated the guest list. This was an all-male affair. Freeborn men only. Slaves they served. Women, only courtesans or hetairai were allowed inside. The wives stayed home. The evening began with a meal, the dapanon, where everyone would eat reclining on couches, heads propped up on cushions like relaxed philosophers. This wasn't the symposium proper. This was the warm-up. No alcohol yet. That came after. Because once the food was cleared and the floor swept, the real event began. The wine was mixed with water in a large crater. To drink wine unmixed, as the Scythians did, was considered uncivilized. The symposiarch decided the ratio week. You're here for conversation. Strong. You're here for chaos. It was a fine line, too sober, and things stayed stiff, too drunk, and Plato's dialogues turned into a Dionysian disaster. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Every symposium had a purpose, usually philosophical, political, or poetic. But underlying all that was a sense of sacred leisure, what the Greeks called schola. This wasn't wasted time. It was where ideas were born, where young aristocrats sharpened their minds, played verbal games, composed impromptu poetry, and maybe, just maybe, fell in love. Before the debate started, libations were poured to Dionysus, the god of wine and divine madness. There was singing, sometimes by hired musicians, sometimes by the guests themselves. A flute girl might play. A courtesan might challenge a guest to a riddle, but everything was structured. The wine passed clockwise. Each round came with a toast. Drinking too fast was frowned upon. Getting sloppy was shameful. The ideal guest? Witty, graceful, and just drunk enough to tell the truth beautifully. In the end, the symposium was a performance, a place where men proved their intellect as much as their tolerance for wine. It was a dance between reason and indulgence. And if you broke the rules, you weren't just embarrassing yourself. You were insulting the very spirit of the gathering. The physical setting of a symposium was no accident. It was a stage for both mind and body to perform. The event typically took place in a specially designed room in a Greek household called the andron, reserved solely for men. It was a square space lined with couches or clean eyes, each wide enough for a man to recline on his side while propped up on one elbow. The center was left open, perfect for servants to pour wine, dancers to perform, or for the occasional impromptu game involving tossing wine leaves at a target. Yes, they had drinking games too. Light came from flickering oil lamps, and the air was thick with the scent of burning incense, roasted meats, and the occasional perfume worn by courtesans. It was intimate, sensual, and designed to lower inhibitions without erasing the intellect. The couches were arranged in a circle, encouraging eye contact, verbal sparring, and shared laughter. This wasn't just architecture. It was psychology. Everyone had equal status here. No one sat at the head of a table. No one was above another. This spatial equality fostered philosophical democracy, an egalitarian moment in a deeply hierarchical world. The mood could shift dramatically depending on the host and a mix of guests. Some symposia were political strategy sessions disguised as drinking parties. Others devolved into singing contests and naked dancing. And some, like the one described in Plato's Symposium, were lofty, abstract, and almost religious in tone. But they all began in the same place, with a shared space, a shared drink, and a shared sense that something important was about to happen. Even the decor mattered. Walls were often adorned with mythological paintings. Hercules feasting with the gods, Dionysus leading his drunken revelers, satyrs chasing nymphs. These were not just pretty images. They were reminders of the thin veil between civilization and ecstatic chaos. They whispered, "This is play, but it's sacred play." And let's not forget the wine itself. Served in decorated cups, chai-likes, these often had erotic or comic scenes painted at the bottom, slowly revealed as the drinker emptied his cup. The moment of draining your drink came with a laugh, a blush, or a clever comment, depending on who was watching. At the heart of many symposia was a dynamic that still baffles and fascinates modern minds. The paiderastia relationship between an older man, Theris, and a younger male beloved, Therimenos. This wasn't just tolerated, it was idealized. The older man was the teacher, the lover, the sponsor of intellect and refinement. The younger man, usually a teenage boy of aristocratic birth, was the student and the object of admiration, and the symposium was their theater. This bond wasn't purely carnal, at least not in theory. It was supposed to be about virtue, discipline, and the passing down of knowledge and moral character. But that didn't stop the air in the symposium from becoming charged with erotic tension. The older men would use clever wordplay and recited poetry to woo the beautiful youths reclining beside them. Compliments were expected. Groping was frowned upon. The key was restraint. It proved control, dignity, and the seriousness of one's intent. The beloved, meanwhile, was expected to resist, at least publicly. His virtue lay in how well he could deflect advances with grace and wit. A boy who gave in too easily lost social value. A boy who refused everyone forever, risked seeming cold or arrogant. The ideal Oraminos kept everyone guessing. He blushed, he deflected, he teased, and above all, he listened. He was expected to absorb not just affection, but wisdom. Now, not every guest engaged in these dynamics. Married men were supposed to behave, but let's be honest, many didn't. Courtesans and heteri were allowed to offer physical pleasure, but the boys were meant to offer something higher. Inspiration. They were the muses of the male elite. Their youth reminded older men of fleeting beauty, of time's cruel advance, of why philosophy mattered in the first place. Plato famously used a symposium to explore the nature of love itself. Eros is a ladder, beginning with physical attraction and rising toward divine contemplation. But that lofty climb began quite literally on a couch beside a beautiful boy. The intimacy of the setting made it possible to speak of the soul without embarrassment, to admit longing without shame. Wine was not just a beverage at the symposium. It was the fuel, the compass, and the test. But the Greeks didn't drink the way we do today. To them, consuming wine unmixed with water was considered the mark of a savage. The ideal Greek drinker diluted his wine with at least 3 parts water. Why? Because wine was not meant to overwhelm. It was meant to loosen the tongue without dulling the mind, central crater. A large mixing vessel sat in the middle of the room like an altar. The symposiarch, often elected for the evening, decided the wine-to-water ratio. He wielded great power. A strong mix meant a wild night. A weak one signaled a night of poetry and discourse. It was a delicate balance, too sober and the evening dragged, too drunk, and you might vomit on your neighbor's sandals and earn eternal shame. Each guest was given a cup, often beautifully painted, and the wine was ladled out in rounds. It flowed clockwise, with each man taking a sip before passing it on. But it wasn't just about drinking, it was about rhythm. Each round came with a toast, a song, a witty remark. Wine invited vulnerability, creativity, and occasionally madness. The Greeks believed Dionysus, god of wine, could inspire both divine insight and complete insanity, depending on how much you poured. And pour they did, but not without purpose. There was an art to pacing oneself. A truly respectable guest could drink several rounds, trade clever jabs, recite Homer, and still sit upright. Losing control? That was for barbarians. In fact, the symposium was partly a training ground. To show that a real man could enjoy pleasure and still govern himself, self-control, even in intoxication, was a virtue. That said, not all. Guests adhered to the ideal. The drunk who danced naked, knocked over the lyre player, or mistook the serving boy for a satyr became the subject of ridicule for years. Stories of symposium disasters were passed around like cautionary tales. But on the flip side, the slightly tipsy philosopher who spoke beautifully on the nature of justice or love might be remembered for eternity. Not every moment at a symposium was philosophical pondering. When the wine flowed and minds loosened, the Greeks turned to games and music, deliberate, structured amusements that revealed a man's spirit, cleverness, and social finesse. The symposium wasn't just a place for intellectual showmanship, it was a playground for performance. One of the most popular games was Kotarbos, a bizarre and surprisingly elegant pastime. Guests would flick the dregs of their wine at a target, often a saucer balanced on a stand or floating in a bowl of water, trying to knock it over with a well-aimed splash. Success wasn't just about skill. It was symbolic. Men often called out the name of a lover while launching their wine, cheeky blend of flirtation and athleticism. Hit the mark. The gods approved your passion, miss. Well, maybe you weren't worthy of her or him. Music was ever present. A hired flute girl olatrice might play haunting tunes to accompany a toast or dance between courses. Sometimes she danced herself, swirling in rhythm with the rising heat of the evening. But the guests didn't just listen, they performed. Reciting Homer, improvising erotic poetry, or singing drinking songs was not optional. It was expected that a man who couldn't carry a tune or deliver a clever verse was silently judged, even pitted. But the real performance was verbal. Witty banter, sympathetic conversation was an art form. Verbal duels tested memory, wordplay, philosophical knowledge, and charm. Men would pose riddles, challenge each other to poetic improvisation, or tell biting jokes. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about finesse. The best conversationalist was quick, thoughtful, and slightly provocative. And then there were the riddles, sometimes philosophical, sometimes obscene. A well-timed riddle could silence a room or send it into raucous laughter. The most admired guest could deliver a dirty pun and a theory of justice in the same breath. And if the room was right, if the wine was balanced and the company sharp, the entire event took on a magical atmosphere. Half performance, half revelation. The goal of it all wasn't just to impress, it was to connect, to build bonds, to let personality, intellect, and desire intertwine. In this playful chaos, reputations were made or destroyed, because in the Greek symposium you weren't just judged by what you thought, but by how cleverly you could say it while half drunk and draped in a tunic. While Greek wives stay behind closed doors, barred from the intellectual and sensual world of the symposium, another kind of woman moved freely through the flickering lamplight. Hetaira. These high-class courtesans were not mere entertainers or sex workers. They were educated, witty, and trained in music, conversation, and seduction. They weren't just present at the symposium, they were vital to it. A Hetaira could recite poetry, sing alongside the lyre, debate philosophical ideas, and outfit even the cleverest aristocrats, unlike most Greek women. She was not confined to the household. She could own property, attend parties, and even accumulate wealth. Some became legendary, like Aspasia, the famed partner of Pericles, who was rumored to have taught rhetoric to Athens' greatest minds. But make no mistake, their position was complex. They walked a thin line between celebrated and scorned. Revered for their intellect and charm, they were also objects of lust and satire still. In the wine-soaked world of the symposium, Hetaira was often the only woman who could speak freely and be heard. Their presence changed the dynamic with them. The evening was no longer just a boys' club of philosophy and flirting. It became a charged, unpredictable dance of power and performance. A well-placed remark from a Hetaira could deflate a man's ego or spark a debate that lasted all night. They were conversational warriors trained to challenge, tease, and occasionally humiliate. Eroticism was always in the air, but it wasn't always consummated. The flirtation, the tension, that was the point. Some heteri were lovers. Others remained distant, using allure as leverage. They played by their own rules, often using their beauty and wit to climb socially or manipulate political alliances. For many men, these women represented a fantasy. Female companionship without domestic duty, sensuality without obedience, intellect without inhibition. They were free in a way that Greek wives could never be, and that made them both intoxicating and dangerous. In a room designed for male pleasure, Hetaira were a reminder that true control was never fully in male hands. They could ruin a joke, redirect a debate, or inspire a poem that would be remembered for generations. In a culture obsessed with power and performance, they were masters of both. While the symposium had its fair share of games, flirtation, and poetic excess, its greatest legacy may be intellectual. Beneath the laughter and rising intoxication, something remarkable happened. Serious thought took root. These were not mere drinking parties. They were laboratories of the mind, somewhere between the third cup of wine and the last riddle. The guests often launched into debates that would shape Western philosophy forever. The most famous example, of course, is Plato's Symposium, a fictionalized account of a real gathering where Socrates, Alcibiades, Aristophanes, and others explored the nature of love. But this wasn't an isolated event. Across Greece, especially in Athens, symposiums were known as places where ideas collided. Public issues, metaphysics, morality, and human desire were all on the menu. These debates weren't lectures. They were battles of logic, of wit, of emotional conviction. The setting mattered. Wine lowered defenses, humor softened blows, and the intimate space gave permission for vulnerability. You could challenge a man's view on justice, his belief in the gods, or even his sexual preferences. And if you were clever enough, earn his respect. One of the central themes was eros, erotic love, not just in the carnal sense, but as a philosophical force. Socrates, through Plato, described love as a ladder. It starts with physical attraction, rises through appreciation of beauty, and culminates in the contemplation of the eternal form of beauty itself. That idea was born at a symposium. But other topics came up too. What is virtue? What makes a man wise? Can the soul be immortal? Is pleasure a good in itself, or merely a distraction? These were not academic questions. They were urgent, personal, and delivered in between sips of spiced wine. It's no coincidence that many of the great thinkers of Greece, Socrates, Plato, Xenophon, frequented symposia. These events were incubators of thought. They offered a rare combination: leisure, intellect, sensuality, and challenge. And unlike public forums, the symposium allowed for nuance. You could speak freely, revise your opinions mid-sentence, or offer an idea half-formed and see where it went. For all their intellectual ambition and poetic charm, symposia could, and often did, spiral into chaos. While philosophers dreamed of truth and beauty, reality had a habit of barging in. Wine-soaked and staggering, the symposium's tightrope walk between order and indulgence didn't always end well, and when it failed spectacularly. Take Alcibiades, for example, the handsome, brilliant, and deeply scandalous Athenian statesman. He famously crashed the symposium in Plato's dialogue, already drunk, crowned with ivy like Dionysus himself. Instead of offering a sober reflection on love, he gave a wildly personal and sexually charged speech about Socrates. It was funny, emotional, and borderline inappropriate. The line between admiration and desire blurred, and what was meant to be a noble evening turned into an unfiltered outpouring of drunken obsession. But Alcibiades' antics weren't just awkward, they were prophetic. He would go on to betray Athens, flee to Sparta, switch sides again, and die in exile. His love of wine, performance, and recklessness mirrored the dark side of the symposium culture. Charm without restraint, brilliance without ethics. And he wasn't alone. Many political scandals had their roots in symposia. Gossip spread quickly. Who flirted too boldly? Who got too drunk? Who insulted a guest or blasphemed a god in the haze of wine? It was all noted, whispered, and weaponized. A misstep in a private symposium could ruin a public career. Symposia also became associated with decadence, especially in later periods. As Athens declined and Rome rose, the original balance of intellect and indulgence tilted dangerously toward pure hedonism. Wine was no longer watered down. Guests competed in gluttony instead of poetry. The flute girls outnumbered the philosophers, and what was once sacred play, it became a cynical performance. Even the Spartans, famously austere, mocked Athenian symposia as soft, effeminate, and corrupt. To them, the very idea of reclining on couches, debating love while sipping diluted wine, seemed like a recipe for moral decay. And in some ways it was. Yet the Greeks were aware of the risks. That's why moderation was so prized. A man who could keep his dignity while drunk, charm without seducing, and arguing without humiliating, was the true hero of the symposium. Long after the last crater was emptied and the last lyre note faded, the Greek symposium left behind something far more enduring than a hangover, a legacy of intellectual culture that still shapes how we think, talk, and connect today. What began as a structured drinking party became one of history's most unlikely engines of philosophy, art, and social development. The symposium offered a radical idea, a especially for its time, that leisure wasn't merely idleness, it was sacred space. Schola, the Greek word for leisure, is the root of our word school. That's no accident. The symposium turned leisure into a crucible for learning. It proved that wisdom didn't have to come from temples or classrooms alone. It could emerge amid wine, laughter, flirtation, and flame-lit debate. Plato's Symposium is the most famous relic of this world, and its impact is hard to overstate. It gave us not just a model of structured philosophical dialogue, but enduring concepts like Platonic love, the ladder of Eros, and the idea that beauty and truth are intimately connected. The format of that work, men reclining, drinking, and riffing on a shared theme, will become the prototype for everything from university seminars to late-night salons. The Romans inherited the symposium and transformed it into the convivium, a more lavish, less philosophical affair. But the structure remained. Medieval and Renaissance thinkers reawakened the spirit of the symposium in their own salons, circles, and societies. And even today, we carry echoes of it. The dinner party that turns into a deep conversation at midnight. The book club that spends more time on existential questions than the actual book. The podcast where two minds drink, laugh, and dissect reality. Even the symposium's flaws have left their mark. The gender exclusivity, the hierarchies of beauty and age, the danger of excess, all remain relevant as cautionary tales on how communities are built and broken. But perhaps its greatest gift was the idea that pleasure and thinking need not be at odds, that beauty, desire, humor, and intellect could all share a single room, that truth could be seduced, not just reasoned. In the end, the Greek Symposium wasn't just where philosophy met pleasure. It was where civilization discovered that the mind, the body, and the spirit all need a place to play. And in that sacred wine-slicked space, the Western world learned how to talk. Imagine walking through the streets of ancient Thebes or Memphis. The heat radiates off the limestone, and the air smells of incense, lotus, and palm wine. But what grabs your attention isn't the temples or the towering obelisks. It's the people, men and women alike, their faces adorned with thick black eyeliner that extends dramatically from the corners of their eyes. Their heads are crowned not with natural hair, but with ornate wigs, braided, curled, sometimes perfumed. It's striking, unmistakable, and absolutely everywhere. In ancient Egypt, personal appearance wasn't just a matter of vanity, it was a coded language. What you wore on your head and painted around your eyes told the world who you were, what you believed, and where you stood in society. Wigs and eyeliner weren't mere trends. They were statements of identity, spirituality, and hygiene. Eyeliner made from a dark green pigment called malachite, or the more famous kohl from Galena, a black lead sulfide, was applied with careful precision. The look was bold, but not just for beauty. It was believed to protect the eyes from harsh sunlight, much like how athletes today use black grease. More importantly, it had deep spiritual and medicinal significance. The ancient Egyptians believed the pigment protected against evil spirits and infections, especially from the Nile's ever-present flies and bacteria. This wasn't superstition alone. Modern science has confirmed that lead-based kohl may have had antimicrobial properties. So yes, your eyeliner could save your life. As for the wigs, they were more than fashionable headpieces. Hair was shaved regularly to maintain cleanliness and prevent lice. Wigs were worn daily by elites and on special occasions by commoners. The material varied from wool, plant fiber, or human hair, and so did the complexity. Some were simple plaits, others towering structures of curls, beads, and even gold ornaments. A well-made wig was expensive and a symbol of wealth, much like a tailored suit or luxury handbag today. Together, the wig and the eyeliner created a persona, controlled, composed, and sacred. To appear in public without them, especially in the upper classes, would be unthinkable. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about being civilized, clean, protected, and in harmony with the gods. To ancient Egyptians, kohl wasn't just makeup. It was protection, identity, and even a kind of prayer. Both men and women, rich and poor, lined their eyes with bold strokes of black, stretching the pigment out toward the temples in elegant, sweeping arcs. And they didn't do it because it looked cool, though it absolutely did. They did it because the eyes were sacred. The ancient word for eye makeup was made-up, and applying it was an almost ritual act. The most common formula was made from galena, a dark gray mineral ground into fine powder and mixed with oils or animal fat. Applied with a stick, it formed that iconic black eyeliner that defined Egyptian faces for centuries. But there was more to it than aesthetics. Galena was thought to repel illness and misfortune. It wasn't just paint, it was magic. Why the obsession with the eyes? Because in Egyptian mythology, the eye had power. The Eye of Horus, one of the most enduring symbols of protection and royal authority, represented healing and wholeness. To line one's eyes with kohl was to invoke this protective symbol, to spiritually and physically shield oneself from harm. And protection was no small matter in the ancient world, the Nile. While the giver of life also brought disease and pests, flies, dust, bacteria, these were everyday concerns. Kohl may have acted as an early form of sunscreen and an antimicrobial barrier. Archaeologists even found that the lead salts in kohl stimulated nitric oxide production in the skin, which helps the immune system. So in a very real sense, it healed while it was decorated. But the use of kohl wasn't the same for everyone. The wealthy had access to finely milled galena and decorative applicators made from ivory or polished wood. Poorer citizens might use simpler versions or crushed charcoal, but the impulse to adorn and protect the eyes transcended class. Even laborers could be found with lined eyes, their own form of everyday sacredness. Interestingly, the act of painting one's eyes was deeply sensual, and not just in the modern cosmetic sense. It was intimate. To prepare your eyes for the world meant preparing your soul. It was a connection to the divine, the hygienic, and the erotic, all traced along the lash line. In ancient Egypt, your hair, or more precisely, your wig, told people everything they needed to know about you. Who you were, how clean you were, how rich you were, how close to the gods you stood. Wigs weren't just vanity. They were status, practicality, and ritual, all woven into a single elegant headpiece. Let's start with the basics. Most Egyptians shaved their heads. The reasons were practical and cultural. In the sweltering Egyptian climate, real hair was hot, sweaty, and a magnet for lice. Shaving it off was cleaner, cooler, and far more comfortable. But walking around bald didn't exactly scream elegant. So enter the wig. Wigs were usually worn by the elite, pharaohs, priests, and wealthy nobles, but even middle-class citizens had simpler versions. They were made from a variety of materials, depending on your social standing. The richest Egyptians commissioned wigs made from human hair, sometimes mixed with plant fibers or sheep's wool to add volume and structure. These wigs could be styled with elaborate curls, tight braids, or layered plaits, often set with beeswax and perfumed cones of scented fat, but slowly melted into the scalp as the day wore on. In a word, luxurious. The shapes and styles were also statements. A short geometric bob might indicate a formal occasion, while long cascading locks with golden beads screamed royal power. High-ranking priests often wore specific styles associated with their temple duties, and children, even royal ones, were sometimes depicted with the famous side lock of youth. Often shaved clean, except for one ornate braid. But wigs were more than just aesthetic armor. They were deeply symbolic. To cover one's head was to signify control, purity, and divine alignment. Priests shaved completely before entering temples, but would don wigs when performing outside rituals, highlighting the difference between spiritual sanctity and public presentation. Over time, wigs became heirlooms, passed down or buried with their owners. A fine wig might be placed carefully in a tomb, its strands still holding their form after thousands of years. Some mummies have even been found with wigs still in place, delicate braids and tight curls resting above a silent face, ready for the afterlife. If wigs were the crown, perfume cones were the halo. No look in ancient Egypt was complete without fragrance. Literally worn on your head, these odd-looking blobs we see in Egyptian art perched atop elaborately braided wigs. They weren't just artistic flourishes, they were perfume cones, solid mixtures of oils, fat, and scent meant to slowly melt and bathe the wearer in divine aroma. The cones were made from a base of animal fat or beeswax infused with myrrh, frankincense, lotus, or cinnamon. As the day went on and the desert sun beat down, the cones would soften, slowly releasing their scent. This wasn't just for personal pleasure. It was a statement. I am clean. I am sacred. I smell like the God sent in. Egypt wasn't a luxury. It was a moral good. Cleanliness was next to godliness, quite literally. The gods were believed to be fragrant, and temples burned incense daily to invite them in. To walk through a city smelling like lotus or frankincense wasn't just attractive, it was spiritually resonant. A perfumed person was a civilized person, a person in harmony with Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of cosmic balance and order. Perfume cones weren't just for special occasions either. While elite Egyptians wore them to banquets and ceremonies, the daily act of anointing the body with oils and fragrant balms was common practice among all classes. Laborers, after a day's work in the sun, would wash and oil themselves. It was part of being human and part of being worthy. Wigs often had their own scent too. Some were stored with perfumed leaves or herbs braided directly into the strands. Others were refreshed with oils rubbed gently into the fibers. A wealthy Egyptian's hair didn't just look good, it smelled divine, and that smell signaled everything's status, piety, and erotic appeal. Interestingly, this attention to fragrance also had practical benefits. The melting cones acted as a moisturizer in Egypt's arid climate, protecting hair and scalp. They may have even repelled insects. Once again, beauty and function went hand in hand. One of the most striking features of ancient Egyptian beauty culture was its egalitarian approach to cosmetics. In a world where modern standards often assign makeup and grooming to women alone, ancient Egypt blurs the lines. Men wore eyeliner. Women shaved their heads. Everyone oiled their skin, perfumed their bodies, and wore wigs on special occasions. Beauty was not gendered. It was sacred, hygienic, and deeply social. A high-status Egyptian man might begin his day with a full body wash, followed by anointing himself with scented oils. Then came the application of kohl. Yes, thick black eyeliner applied with a smooth hand to both upper and lower eyelids. The eyes were extended outward with that iconic line we still associate with pharaohs and gods. It wasn't vanity, it was identity. Women followed a similar ritual, though with even more complexity in hair and fragrance. The beauty standards for elite women were steep pale skin, elaborate wigs, painted lips using ochre or carmine, and wide, defined eyes. But here's the twist. These routines weren't about competing with other women or impressing men. They were about aligning oneself with the divine. After all, the gods themselves were depicted in full regalia, heavily adorned, beautified, radiant. Androgyny, in fact, played a powerful symbolic role in Egyptian iconography. The gods blurred gender roles constantly. Hathor, the goddess of beauty and fertility, was both motherly and erotic. Osiris, ruler of the underworld, was depicted with green skin, a fake beard, and makeup, hardly hypermasculine. Even pharaohs like Akhenaten were portrayed with curiously genderless features. Soft bellies, almond eyes, wide hips. This cultural acceptance of beautification across genders created a society where appearance was not just tolerated, it was expected. A man who didn't line his eyes or keep himself perfumed could be seen as lazy, uncivilized, or even irreligious. Personal grooming wasn't an indulgence, it was a duty. Even servants and laborers partook in the ritual, though with simpler materials. They might use soot instead of galena, plant oils instead of expensive perfume, linen wigs rather than human hair. But the impulse was the same, to present oneself as whole, clean, and worthy of respect. In ancient Egypt, to be clean was to be close to the gods. Dirt wasn't just unpleasant, it was unholy, and personal hygiene was a form of spiritual discipline. That's why wigs, eyeliner, perfumes, and cosmetics weren't just accessories of wealth or vanity. They were physical proof of your class, your discipline, and your worthiness to participate in society. Let's start with the basics. Hair. Shaving the head and body was common among both men and women. Hair trapped, sweat and lice, enemies in the desert climate. A clean-shaven scalp signified order, self-control, and spiritual cleanliness. That's why priests who served in temples were required to shave completely and bathe multiple times a day. Their ritual duties demanded not just piety, but visible purity. Wigs then became both a practical and symbolic solution, offering style while allowing one to remain ritually clean underneath. Bathing was a daily practice for anyone who could afford the time and water. The wealthier you were, the more elaborate your hygiene routine. Wealthy households had footed basins and servants who poured water scented with lotus or rose petals over your body. You'd scrub yourself with natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt that serves as soap, and follow it up with a generous application of oil to keep the skin supple. Your fragrance, too, told others how much you were worth. A cheap oil made from castor or morna might get you through the day, but frankincense, cinnamon, or lotus oils, those mark you as someone of distinction. To be clean and perfumed was to be respectable. To be unwashed or smelly wasn't just a personal failing, it was a social scandal. And what about your eyeliner? The quality of your kohl, how finely it was ground, what minerals it used, and how artistically it was applied, was another visible marker of class. Sloppy lines or cheap materials would betray you immediately. A nobleman's kohl case might be made of ivory or alabaster, a laborer's carved roughly from clay or wood. Clothing, too, reinforced these hygiene signals. Light white linen was preferred. Clean, breathable, and symbolic of purity. Stains or unwashed fabrics suggested laziness or low status in ancient Egypt. Beauty wasn't just for the living. It followed you into the afterlife. The same kohl, wigs, and perfumes that signaled cleanliness, class, and devotion in daily life were carefully included in tombs to accompany the dead. Death to the Egyptians was not the end. It was a transition, and you were expected to look your best when meeting the gods. Tomb paintings and grave goods reveal just how deeply beauty rituals were tied to funerary practices. Elite mummies were buried with jars of cosmetics, kohl pots, wig boxes, mirrors, scented oils, and even combs and razors. In some cases, the deceased was depicted on the coffin itself, with elaborately painted eyes and perfectly styled hair, often wearing a ceremonial wig adorned with gold or lapis. The message was clear. The soul should arrive in the next world, clean, composed, and divine. Priests who prepared the body performed rituals that included cosmetic application. They painted the eyes with black lines, anointed the skin with oils, and sometimes even fitted the deceased with a wig before wrapping the body in linen. The intention was twofold: preserve the body and elevate the spirit. Beauty here wasn't just ceremonial, it was transformational. The opening of the mouth ceremony, one of the most vital rites for the dead, symbolically restored the senses, sight, smell, speech to the departed soul. The beautifully lined eyes of the deceased were not merely symbolic. They were meant to see again in the afterlife. The perfume cones and sacred oils helped the spirit smell the sweet air of paradise, and the polished mirrors ensured the dead could admire their own perfected form for eternity. Even gods of death and protection were depicted as beautiful. Anubis, the jackal-headed embalmer, appears with black-lined eyes and sleek, idealized features. Isis and Nephthys, protectors of the dead, were always shown with perfect hair and divine cosmetics, models for both the living and the dying. For Egyptians to be well-groomed in death was to show respect to the gods and signal readiness for rebirth, to decay, to stink, to appear unkempt. These weren't just physical failings, they were spiritual ones. Beneath the elegance of ancient Egyptian beauty, rituals lay a world of practical tools, well-crafted, ritualized, and surprisingly sophisticated. If you were an elite Egyptian preparing for a banquet, temple service, or your own burial, you didn't just slap on kohl with your finger or run a comb through your hair blindly. You had a personal beauty kit, often as finely made and symbolically charged as any religious artifact. Let's start with mirrors. Made from polished copper or bronze, these handheld discs gleamed enough to reflect the face clearly, at least for those who could afford them. These mirrors often had ornate handles carved from wood, ivory, or faience, and shaped like gods, lotus stems, or protective deities. Gazing into one was not just about vanity, it was a reminder of order, symmetry, and divine harmony. Kohl applicators were another essential. These were not flimsy brushes, but thin rods, sometimes carved from bone, ivory, or metal, designed to dip into stone or ceramic pots filled with powdered galena or malachite. The act of lining one's eyes with these tools was often meditative, precise, and done with great care. Some of these applicators were so treasured they were buried with their owners. Wig combs were flat, wide, and made from carved wood or ivory, designed to gently untangle the intricate braids and curls of elaborate wigs. Wealthier individuals had full grooming kits that included razors for shaving, tweezers for plucking stray hairs, and even scent jars designed to hold various fragrant bombs. Some high-ranking women even had servants whose sole job was maintaining wigs and mixing personalized perfume blends. Cosmetic palettes, slabs of stone used to grind and mix pigments, were part of nearly every household. Even children's tombs sometimes contained small palettes, indicating how early beauty rituals began. The famous Narmer palette, one of Egypt's earliest archaeological finds, shows cosmetic tools already present at the dawn of Egyptian civilization, blending politics, ritual, and aesthetics into one stone. These tools weren't hidden in drawers. They were proudly displayed, often decorated with animal motifs or inscribed with protective spells. They serve as reminders that beauty wasn't separate from life. It was central to it. You weren't just painting your face. You were participating in a sacred art form, using tools blessed by centuries of tradition. Thousands of years have passed since the last pharaoh applied his kohl, or a noblewoman placed a perfumed cone atop her wig. Yet the visual language of ancient Egyptian beauty continues to ripple through history, echoing in everything from high fashion to modern makeup tutorials. What began as sacred ritual and social necessity along the banks of the Nile now lives on in catwalks, cosmetics, and cultural imagination. Start with eyeliner, the bold extended line from the corner of the eye, that unmistakable cat eye straight out of Egypt. Cleopatra didn't invent the look, but she certainly perfected it. And her image, widely circulated in art and cinema, turned Egyptian eye makeup into a global symbol of allure, mystery, and power. Today's eyeliner trends, whether high fashion or everyday glam, still chase that same elongated, dramatic form born in the temples of Hathor and the tombs of queens. Wigs, too, have made their rounds. Ancient Egyptians treated them not as mere fashion, but as expressions of hygiene, status, and control. Today they represent transformation, identity, and even empowerment, worn proudly by celebrities, cancer survivors, and cultural performers alike. In many ways, the modern wig still carries the same message. I choose how I present myself to the world, and let's not forget skincare. The Egyptians were early masters of moisturizing, exfoliating, and perfuming the body. They used oils, salts, and clays not just for function, but as expressions of spirituality and discipline. Today's multi-step skincare routines, their DNA can be traced straight back to the anointing jars of Thebes. Even in pop culture, ancient Egyptian beauty refuses to die. Films, music videos, fashion shows, and cosmetics branding continually mine the visual power of Nefertiti's cheekbones or Tutankhamun's dramatic mask. These weren't just royalty, they were icons. Their beauty standards, once grounded in sacred relief, have become shorthand for elegance and mystery. But what endures most is the idea that beauty is never just about looking good. For the Egyptians, it was health, holiness, identity, and social structure, all painted in black coal and sculpted in curled wigs. And in a world that still wrestles with image, self-expression, and ritual, their message remains timeless. Beauty is power. Beauty is protection. Beauty is the purpose. And from the temples of Karnak to the vanities of today, that truth still lines our eyes. In the dying days of 1606, 3 small ships, Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, slipped away from the foggy shores of England under the banner of the Virginia Company. A private joint stock enterprise, the Virginia Company wasn't launching this voyage for charity or for the crown's glory. It was a business venture driven by dreams of gold, silk, spices, and, above all, profit. What they got instead was mud, disease, starvation, and a tiny, fragile outpost that would become the seed of British America. The men aboard these ships were a curious blend. There were seasoned sailors and laborers, but also many gentlemen, men with swords and titles, but no farming experience. Most had no idea how to build a colony. Few had ever done hard manual labor in their lives. Their expectations were wildly out of step, with reality waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. After more than 4 months at sea, Including a stop in the Canary Islands and a storm-battered journey through the Caribbean, the expedition finally arrived in what would later be called Virginia. On May 14, 1607, the settlers selected a swampy, uninhabited peninsula along the James River to build their settlement. They named it Jamestown in honor of King James III. From a defensive standpoint, the site seemed ideal. It was far inland enough to avoid detection by the Spanish Navy and surrounded by water on three sides, offering protection from possible native attacks. But the location came with a cost. Brackish, undrinkable water, rampant mosquitoes, and poor soil. It was, in almost every practical sense, a death trap. Still, they unloaded their supplies and began constructing a wooden fort. The settlers had little idea what awaited them. Harsh summers, freezing winters, and a thin supply line stretched across the ocean. Within weeks, illness began to spread. The water made them sick. Food was scarce. Leadership was weak. Arguments constant. And yet, in that miserable, mosquito-infested patch of land, they laid the first stones of what would eventually grow into an empire. The gamble was massive. The risk was astronomical. But the dream of empire, wealth, and glory drove them forward, blind to the disaster that was already beginning to unfold. Jamestown had been founded, but survival, that was a whole other matter. From the moment the settlers set foot on Jamestown soil, death began slowly. Relentless march. The land was lush with promise, but the reality turned cruel. The water was brackish, too salty to drink safely, and too polluted to support life. Crops failed to grow in the sandy and marshy soil, and the men, mostly unused to hard labor, were not prepared to farm, fish, or hunt effectively. Within weeks, dysentery, typhoid, and malaria began to spread. Food supplies ran low almost immediately. Their original stockpiles, brought across the Atlantic, were never meant to last through an entire year. The settlers had counted on regular resupply ships and perhaps some quick local harvesting. Neither materialized. Most of the colonists were gentlemen or craftsmen, not farmers. They lacked the knowledge to grow crops in a new climate, and too many refused manual labor altogether, considering it beneath their station. The summer of 1607 was punishingly hot. Disease ravaged the population. Insects were everywhere. Drinking water from the river only worsened their condition. As hunger grew more desperate, the settlers turned to increasingly grim measures. They boiled leather for broth. They scavenged for roots, acorns, and even snakes and rats. By the winter, known grimly as the starving time, the situation turned horrific. That winter, the colony was under siege, not by Native Americans, but by nature and their own hubris. With Captain John Smith injured and gone, and tensions with the Powhatan Confederacy worsening, trade came to a halt. The settlers were effectively trapped behind the wooden walls of their fort, surrounded by hostile forests and freezing temperatures. Eyewitnesses reported unthinkable acts. The colonists resorted to cannibalism, exhuming corpses and boiling human flesh to survive. George Percy, one of the colony's leaders, later wrote of how they were driven through insufferable hunger to eat those things which nature most abhorred. Of the roughly 500 colonists alive in the fall of 1609, only about 60 survived to see the spring. If Jamestown had a turning point in its early chaos, it came in the form of one man, Captain John Smith. Soldier, adventurer, and as he loved to remind everyone, survivor of many battles, Smith was not a nobleman. He didn't wear a powdered wig or carry a fancy title. But what he lacked in social standing, he made up for in grit, audacity, and hard-earned experience. Exactly what the floundering colony needed. By the fall of 1608, with the death toll rising and morale near collapse, Smith took command. He didn't ask politely. He seized control. The gentlemen who had refused to work found themselves on the receiving end of his infamous policy. He that will not work shall not eat. It wasn't a metaphor. Smith enforced labor, dividing the settlers into work gangs for building, farming, and securing firewood. No one was exempt, not even the gentlemen. Starvation had no respect for social rank. Smith also recognized the necessity of building relationships with the surrounding Powhatan tribes. Where others had treated the natives with suspicion or hostility, Smith brought diplomacy back by force. He traded copper pots and beads for corn and grain, using gifts, threats, and strategic shows of strength to secure food. These exchanges weren't always peaceful, but they often worked in a time when famine haunted every meal. Smith's ability to secure supplies kept the colony from total collapse. He mapped the Chesapeake Bay with military precision, drawing the first accurate charts of the region. These would prove invaluable to future settlers. His exploration also revealed how little the English knew about the land they claimed. They weren't in a void. They were surrounded by powerful, organized native societies that vastly outnumbered them. Despite his success, Smith wasn't loved. He was abrasive, egotistical, and quick to insult his enemies, which in Jamestown was practically everyone. In 1609, a gunpowder explosion left him badly injured. Whether it was sabotage or an accident remains unclear, but the result was final. Smith was sent back to England. Without his leadership, Jamestown fell once more into disarray, but the foundation he laid was discipline, diplomacy, and survival. Left its mark. Captain John Smith didn't build a utopia. He built a chance. And in the wilderness of Virginia, that was more than most could manage. Long before the English ever set sail, the land they arrived on was already governed. It was not empty wilderness, but the heart of a vast and powerful Native American empire, the Powhatan Confederacy. Led by Wahansinakaw, referred to by the English simply as Chief Powhatan, this alliance of over 30 tribes controlled the entire Chesapeake region. They had established villages, cultivated fields, trade networks, and a complex political system. The English were not pioneers, they were intruders. At first, Chief Powhatan saw an opportunity. The newcomers brought metal tools, beads, mirrors, and weapons, items the Powhatans valued. A limited relationship might prove useful, especially if the English remained small and dependent. Early on, food and trade were exchanged. Diplomacy, strained though it was, held, but it was always precarious. In this tense atmosphere, one figure emerged as a symbol of attempted peace: Pocahontas. As Chief Powhatan's daughter, likely around 10 or 11 years old at the time, she was not a princess in European sense, but she was politically important. According to John Smith, she famously saved his life from execution in 1607. Though modern scholars debate whether the story was exaggerated, misinterpreted, or invented altogether. Regardless, Pocahontas became a recurring figure in English accounts, often acting as a messenger or intermediary between the two cultures. But the truce couldn't last. As Jamestown grew, so did English demands for food, land, and dominance. The settlers raided villages when trade faltered. Powhatan warriors retaliated. Trust eroded quickly. The English viewed the land as something to possess, the Powhatan as something to live within. This difference in worldview made peaceful coexistence almost impossible. By 1609, the relationship broke down entirely. The Powhatan Confederacy began a campaign of siege warfare, cutting Jamestown off from food and water during the brutal starving time. Any settlers found outside the fort were ambushed and killed. Inside, colonists starved or died of disease. It was a power struggle, and Powhatan was sending a message. This land was not up for grabs. The English, weakened but defiant, refused to abandon the colony. They believed God and the empire were on their side. The Powhatan believed they were defending their home. The battle for Virginia wasn't just about land. It was about survival, sovereignty, and the refusal to bow. Few names from early American history are as romanticized or misunderstood as Pocahontas. For centuries, her story has been twisted into legend, a native princess saving a white Englishman, bridging two cultures with a single act of love. The truth is far more complex and far more tragic. Pocahontas, whose real name was Matawanka, was the daughter of Chief Powhatan and likely no more than 11 or 12 when the English first arrived. Her interactions with the colonists began early, largely through her connection to John Smith. Whether or not she saved Smith's life, as he later claimed, she did become a symbol of communication between the Powhatan and Jamestown. She brought messages, helped arrange food exchanges, and occasionally appeared at the settlement, though not as some exotic curiosity. But as a political figure in her own right, as tensions grew and diplomacy collapsed, Pocahontas disappeared from the English record for several years. Then, in 1613, everything changed. During one of the many skirmishes between the colonists and native tribes, Pocahontas was captured by the English and held as a bargaining chip. Her captors demanded her father return English prisoners and stolen weapons. Chief Powhatan stalled. Pocahontas remained in captivity. During her imprisonment, Pocahontas converted to Christianity and was baptized as Rebecca. Some say she did so willingly. Others argue it was a coerced conversion. Either way, the transformation made her an ideal tool for colonial propaganda. She married John Rolfe, a tobacco planter, in 1614. Their union temporarily helped secure peace between the English and the Powhatan, in what came to be known as the Peace of Pocahontas. But this was no fairy tale. Pocahontas never returned to live among her people. In 1616, she was taken to England as a living advertisement for the success of the Jamestown experiment. She was paraded before nobles and King James himself, dressed in English gowns, speaking their language, her identity overwritten by colonial ambition in 1617, while preparing to return to Virginia. Pocahontas died suddenly, likely of illness. She was around 21. Her death ended any illusion that harmony between the English and Powhatan could be sustained. Pocahontas lived between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. To the English, she was a symbol of conquest and assimilation. To her people, perhaps, a tragic reminder of what was being lost. By 1610, Jamestown had survived starvation, disease, leadership collapses, and warfare, but barely. The colony still lacked what the Virginia Company wanted: most profit. There was no gold, no silk, and no spices. Investors back in London were growing restless. Colonization was expensive, and Jamestown was starting to look like a costly failure. What the settlers needed was a cash crop, something the English market would crave, and they found it in a leafy, bitter plant: tobacco. Enter John Rolfe. A young widower and ambitious planter, Rolfe brought with him a strain of tobacco seeds from the Caribbean, specifically Nicotiana tabacum. Unlike the harsher native variety used by the Powhatan, this imported tobacco was smoother, milder, and far more addictive. English consumers couldn't get enough of it. By 1612, Rolfe had successfully cultivated his first crop. Within just a few years, tobacco transformed Jamestown from a starving outpost into a booming economic enterprise. The plant thrived in the warm, humid Virginia climate. Tobacco fields began to sprawl outward from the fortified town, turning once hostile land into agricultural gold. The English had found their reason to stay, but tobacco came with a price. The crop drained soil nutrients quickly, requiring ever more land to maintain yields. That meant encroaching on native territory, further inflaming tensions with the Powhatan. The push for profits clashed directly with indigenous survival. Labor was another issue. Tobacco was incredibly labor-intensive. At first, the English relied on indentured servants, poor Europeans who worked for several years in exchange for passage to the New World. But even this wasn't enough. Within a few decades, Jamestown would begin importing enslaved Africans to meet the demand, laying the groundwork for a brutal system of slavery that would shape American history for centuries. Still, tobacco gave the colony life. Exports soared. New settlers arrived. Land grants expanded. Jamestown was no longer just an imperial experiment. It was a functioning, profitable settlement. It wasn't the future the Virginia Company originally envisioned. They had dreamed of finding gold mines and building cities. What they got was a muddy patch of land and fields full of tobacco. But it worked. And for England, that was enough. Tobacco didn't just save Jamestown. It bound the future of the American colonies to the soil, to labor, and to a deadly kind of success. In August of 1619, a ship anchored near Point Comfort. Not far from Jamestown aboard were around 20 African men and women captured by Portuguese traders, seized by English privateers, and now sold to the English colonists. Their arrival marked a moment both understated and monumental, the first recorded instance of Africans being brought to English North America. The ship, the White Lion, had captured its human cargo from a Portuguese slave ship en route to the Spanish colonies, once in Virginia. The Africans were exchanged for food and supplies. Official records describe them as 20 and odd Negroes, and their exact legal status remains debated by historians. Were they slaves in the full sense, or were they treated like indentured servants expected to earn freedom over time? The truth is complex and ominous. Early records show that some Africans, like Anthony and Isabella, did gain freedom and even own property. But as tobacco profits grew and labor needs increased, the lines between indentured servitude and racial slavery began to harden. What began ambiguously would, within a few decades, evolve into a rigid system of race-based chattel slavery. At first, these Africans joined a colony already dependent on forced labor. The fields of tobacco needed more hands than the English could provide. Indentured European laborers were dying of disease or fleeing into the frontier. The colonial economy was hungry, and African labor, perceived as more durable and less costly in the long term, offered a solution. The 1619 arrival is often considered a foundational moment in American history, not just for Jamestown, but for the nation that would emerge centuries later. It marked the beginning of a racial caste system that would shape laws, economies, and identities for generations. Yet at the time, it likely passed without fanfare. There were no speeches, no records of outrage, no sense of historical turning point, just another transaction in a colony built on survival and profit. But the legacy was profound. Those first Africans, stripped of homeland, family, and freedom, laid roots in Virginia soil. From their suffering and resilience would grow a long, painful chapter of American history. Jamestown wasn't just the birthplace of English America. It was the beginning of something darker too, the American system of racial slavery. By 1619, Jamestown was no longer just a ragged outpost clinging to life. It was an economic engine fueled by tobacco and powered by labor, both indentured and enslaved. Yet profit alone couldn't bind a people together. When the Virginia Company's distant managers in London ignored colonial needs, the settlers demanded a voice. What they got would shape a representative government in English America. In July 1619, Governor George Yardley convened the First General Assembly at Jamestown's church, calling together 22 elected burgesses from various settlements along the James River. It was an unprecedented experiment, colonists choosing their own legislators to enact laws, levy taxes, and address local concerns over 3 days. These burgesses passed ordinances on land distribution, trade with native tribes, and even penalties for drunkenness. A bitter irony in the colony where wine and tobacco flowed freely. This representative body wasn't perfect. Voting was limited to free male property holders, landowners, or those with a certain tobacco yield. Yet it established a principle. Political power derived from consent, not just royal decree. When new settlers objected to unfair taxes or arbitrary arrest, they appealed not to the company's distant directors, but to their elected burgesses. Jamestown residents now had a mechanism to protect their interests, if they could only keep it alive amid crises. Trouble arrived swiftly. English reinforcements failed to arrive in 1622, and the Powhatan Confederacy launched a coordinated attack that killed 1/4 of the colony in a single morning. The General Assembly reconvened at Smith's 100, debating emergency measures for defense and welfare. They authorized militias, regulated trade licenses, and organized food stores. The Assembly became not just a legislative body, but a lifeline. Yet the Virginia Company's mismanagement persisted. Reports of misused funds, high mortality, and intermittent supplies angered King James III. In 1624, he dissolved the company's charter and proclaimed Virginia a royal colony. Jamestown's governor was now appointed by the Crown, but the General Assembly remained intact, an enduring legacy of 1619. Through charter collapse, deadly attacks, and economic turmoil, Jamestown's self-government proved its worth. The colony had transformed from a private venture into a political community, forging institutions that would outlast its cradle of mud and mosquitoes. As tobacco fields expanded and new settlers arrived, the idea that ordinary colonists could elect representatives became woven into the DNA of English America, a seed planted at a battered church in Jamestown, ready to bear fruit in the centuries to come. By the mid-1620s, Jamestown had evolved far beyond a struggling outpost into something entirely new, the symbolic and practical heart of English America. Yet its survival had been brutal. Thousands of lives had been lost through starvation, warfare, disease, and exploitation. The settlement's resilience, however, set a pattern that would shape the future colonies, the United States itself, and the modern world. Jamestown established critical precedents, both good and troubling. Politically, it pioneered representative government in North America. The General Assembly, founded in 1619, gave settlers a direct voice in local laws and taxation, laying the groundwork for American democracy. It showed colonists they could govern themselves not perfectly, but independently when tensions eventually arose between colonies and the British Crown. It was this deeply rooted tradition of self-rule that would fuel the revolutionary spirit. Economically, Jamestown's tobacco success was equally influential, binding future American prosperity to agricultural exports. Tobacco cultivation sparked a plantation economy that demanded vast amounts of land and labor. This hunger for labor initially led to indentured servitude, but rapidly accelerated into the full-fledged system of racial slavery that would define the American South for centuries. Culturally, Jamestown left lasting imprints too. English traditions, laws, language, and religious practices spread from the muddy banks of the James River to settlements along the Atlantic coast and beyond. Yet it also fostered a culture of violence and racial division embodied by conflicts with native peoples and the exploitation of enslaved Africans. These seeds, planted early, would bloom into generations of systemic inequality and struggle. The Powhatan people paid perhaps the heaviest price. Within decades, disease and conflict decimated their population, destroying an entire way of life. Jamestown's success, built on tobacco and self-government, was intertwined with this devastating loss, a contradiction at the core of American history. Today, Jamestown is remembered not as a simple triumph, but as a story of survival, courage, greed, oppression, and innovation. Its legacy lives in the democratic institutions born from its muddy streets, in the cultural exchange that reshaped global history, and in the deep wounds that still mark the nation's soul. Ultimately, Jamestown's true legacy is complexity itself, a tale not easily simplified into heroes or villains. Instead, it remains a raw, honest mirror reflecting what America would become: ambitious, contradictory, inventive, and often painfully human.